Chapter 24, Part 1 of Discoveries Among the Ruins of Nineveh and Babylon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by William Jones, Bonita Springs, Florida. Discoveries Among the Ruins of Nineveh and Babylon by Austen Layard. Chapter 24, Part 1. A list of topics discussed. Ruins in southern Mesopotamia, departure from Hila, sandhills, villages in the Jazira, Sheikh Karbul, ruins, first view of Nineveh, the marshes, Arab boats, arrive at Souk el-Afaj, Sheikh Agab, town of the Afaj, description of the ruins of Nineveh, excavation in the mounds, discovery of coffins, of various relics, Mr. Loftus's discoveries at Wurka, the Arab tribes, wild beasts, lions, customs of the Afaj, leave the marshes, return to Baghdad, a mirage. The south of Mesopotamia abounds in extensive and important ruins, of which little is known. The country around them is inhabited by Arabs of the tribe of Rubia and Al-Maidan, notorious for their lawlessness and scarcely more intelligent or human than the buffaloes which they tend. One or two travelers have passed these remains of ancient civilization when journeying through the Jazira, or having received descriptions of them from natives of the country. Mr. Loftus was the first to explore the most important. Being attached, as geologist, to the mission for the settlement of the boundaries between Persia and Turkey, he went by land from Baghdad to Busra to join its other members. As he was accompanied by an escort of troops, he was able to visit the principal ruins on the way without risk. He found the tribes well disposed towards Europeans, though very hostile to the Turks. Taking advantage of his favorable feeling and relying upon the protection of the Arab sheikhs, Mr. Loftus returned a second time alone and was able to excavate in some of the larger mounds. He obtained, during this expedition, the highly interesting collection of antiquities from Wurka, now in the British Museum. All these ruins are best reached from Hila. The sheikhs of the Arab tribes living near them are usually in friendly communication with the principal people of that town. Owing, however, to the present disturbed state of the country, I was compelled to ask for safe conduct from Agab, the sheikh of the Afaj. The Afaj dwell in the midst of extensive marshes formed by the Euphrates about 50 miles below Hila. On the eastern border of the swamps rise the great ruins of Nineveh, which I was first desirous of examining. After some discussion, it was finally settled that we were to go by land, keeping as much as possible in the center of Mesopotamia, and thus avoiding the neighborhood of the Euphrates, as the Arabs were now congregated along the banks of the river. Zaid, with Agail of his acquaintance, agreed to accompany me. My own jabours were, of course, of the party. Having hired mules and laid in a proper stock of provisions, tools, and packing cases to hold any antiquities that might be discovered, we began our journey on Wednesday, the 15th of January. The weather was bright and intensely cold. The sky was cloudless, but a biting north wind swept across the plain. It was the middle of the Babylonian winter, and a hard frost daily whitened the ground. We left Hila by the Baghdad gate. The Bir-Akhdar was with me, with the rest of my Mosul servants. My huntsman, old Sayyid Yazim, wrapped up in his thick Arab cloak, bore his favorite hawk on his wrist. He was followed, as usual, by the greyhounds. The jabours went partly on foot, riding by turns on the baggage horses. Mr. Hormuzd Rassam was wanting to complete our party. He had been kept in Baghdad by severe illness almost since our arrival, and for the first time during my wanderings in Mesopotamia, he was not with me. We followed a track leading toward the center of the Mesopotamian desert. Our course was nearly due east. About 6 miles from the town, we found ourselves amidst moving sand hills extending far and wide on all sides. The fine sand shifts with every breeze, and the wrinkled heaps are like the rippled surface of a lake. When the furious southerly wind sweeps over them, it raises a dense, suffocating dust, blinding the wayfaring Arab and leaving him to perish in the trackless labyrinth. After 4 hours' ride, we left the sand heaps and again came in sight of the black belt of palm trees. After stopping to drink water, we proceeded to a small hamlet called Alak, and took up our quarters for the night at the museum of its sheikh, who, notwithstanding his poverty, received us very hospitably. He related to me how from the numerous artificial mounds in the surrounding plains were frequently taken, after rain had washed away the soil, earthen jars and coffins containing ornaments of gold and silver. As we continued our journey during the following day, still keeping in the desert, we passed 1 or 2 small encampments of the Zobaida tribe. The Arabs, alarmed at the approach of so large a party, and believing us to be horsemen on a foray, sallied forth to meet us at some distance from their tents, flourishing their weapons and chanting their wild war cry. The plain, although now without any stationary population, was once thickly inhabited. The lion, the hyena, the wolf, and the jackal, the wild boar, the fox, and the porcupine now alone break the solitude of a wilderness once the seat of the most luxurious and civilized nation in the East. It would be needless to describe the few deserted villages we passed during our day's journey. Their mud walls, once a protection against the wandering Arab, were unable to resist the encroaching sand, which has already overwhelmed the empty dwellings. In this region, the habitations of men are turned almost in a day to mere heaps of earth. The district is called Shomali. After a ride of 6 hours, we reached an ancient mound of considerable size called Harun. On its summit was a ruined Imam Zayda, Mussulman oratory. It was a sacred place to the Arab, and on this account had been used as a burying place. The grave of the wandering Arab is rarely far beneath the surface of the soil, and the wild beasts of the desert soon scrape away the scanty earth. Human skulls and remains, scarcely yet bleached by the sun, were scattered over the ruins, mingled with bricks, pottery, broken glass, and other relics of ancient population. We had scarcely passed Harun when a party of Arabs on horseback and on foot suddenly came forth from behind the lofty banks of a dry canal. They had seen our caravan from afar and had waylaid us. After they had followed us for some distance, they turned back to their tribe, deeming it prudent not to venture an attack, as we were fully prepared for them. Shortly after their departure, a gazelle rose from a thicket and bounded across the plain. Said Jasmine unloosed his hawk, and I pursued with the dogs. The sight of horsemen galloping to and fro alarmed an Arab settlement gathered round a small mud fort belonging to a chief called Kabul. The men armed themselves and came out against us. Our Afij Guides, however, soon made themselves known to them, and they then escorted our caravan to their tents, dancing a wild dance, shouting their war cries, singing war songs, and firing their matchlocks. Most of them had no other clothing than the shirt taken off their shoulders and tied around their loins. Their countenances were singularly ferocious, their bright eyes and white teeth making them even more hideous. Long black matted hair was scattered over their heads in horrid confusion, and their bodies were tanned by the burning sun to the color and substance of old leather. Their sheikh, Kabul, was scarcely less savage in his appearance, though somewhat better clothed. However ill-disposed he might have been toward Europeans or travelers in general, he acknowledged the protection that had been extended to us by the Apache chief, and led me with words of welcome to his spacious tent. His followers, excited by the late alarm, and now full of warlike enthusiasm, were not, however, to be dismissed until they had satisfied themselves by performing various warlike dances. They did so in circles before the tent, raising a few tattered flags, and deafening me by their shouts and barbarous songs. These wild beings, little better than mere beasts, lived in hovels made of mats and brushwood. They fed large herds of buffalo, but the greater part of their sheep and cattle had been driven away by the Bedouins. Their tribe was the Chabanais, a branch of the Al-Ukra. The next morning, Kabul sent his son and a party of horsemen to escort us for some distance on our road. We had to make a considerable circuit to the east to encompass the marsh, which is now spread over the lower part of the Mesopotamian plain. We passed numerous artificial mounds covered with fragments of bricks, pottery, glazed tiles, richly colored glass, and other relics that mark the site of Babylonian ruins. Canals, too, no longer fed by the Euphrates, everywhere crossed our path and limited our view. The parched soil outside the swamp has become fine sand, amidst which small tufts of the hardy tamarisk form the only vegetation. After 2 hours' ride, we emerged from the labyrinth of dry canals, and, ascending a heap of rubbish covering some ancient ruin, we beheld, looming on the horizon like a distant mountain, the principal object of my journey, the mounds of Nineveh. They were still nearly 10 miles from us. Magnified as they were by the mirage, they appeared far to exceed in size and height any artificial elevation that I had hitherto seen. To the east of us rose another great ruin called Zeprina-Jaz, a lofty square mass, apparently of sun-dried brick. It resembled in form and was scarcely less in size than the well-known remains of Akerkuf near Baghdad. Between us and Nineveh were still many mounds of ancient canals. The largest of the former, covered with bricks and pottery, was called by our Arab guides El Hamra, the Red. The principal canal, whose waters had once been confined between two enormous embankments, ran in a direct line toward the ruins. It is now dry, but appears to have once supplied the city. After a journey of 5 hours, we reached the ruins of Nineveh. They differ in general form from the great mounds of Assyria, with which my descriptions may have familiarized the reader. Although at their northeast corner is a cone similar to those of Nimrod and Kala Shirgat, yet in their broken outline, in their division into several distinct parts, they have more the appearance of the remains of different buildings than of one regular platform surrounded by walls. In this respect, they are not unlike the Mujalibe Kasar and the Amran of Babylon. The mounds cover altogether a very considerable area of ground, and stand on the edge of the marsh, which is gradually encroaching upon them, and which occasionally, during the high floods of the Euphrates, completely surrounds them. They are strewed with the usual fragments of brick, glazed and unglazed pottery, and glass. A loose, nitrous soil, into which the feet sink above the ankles, forms a coating about a yard deep over a harder and more compact soil. In the ravines, large earthen jars and portions of brick masonry are occasionally uncovered by the rains. Commencing my search after antiquities as soon as we had reached the summit of the principal mound, it was not long before I discovered in one of these newly formed ruts a perfect vase about 5 feet high, containing human remains. Other objects of the same kind were found by the Arabs who were with me, but I left more careful researches to the time when I could commence excavations below the surface. Leaving, therefore, the ruins, I hastened to the place where my tents were pitched, about 2 miles beyond the ruins in the margin of the marsh. In front of the encampment was a small lake or pond from which the reeds seemed to have been carefully cleared. We had sent one of our Afaj guides to inform Sheikh Agab of our approach. I had not been long seated in my tent when suddenly a number of black boats, each bearing a party of Arabs, darted from the reeds and approached the shore. They were of various sizes. In the bottom of some, 8 or 10 persons sat crouched on their hams. In others, only 1 or 2. Men standing at the head and stern with long bamboo poles of great lightness guided and impelled them. The largest were built of teak wood, but the others consisted simply of a very narrow framework of rushes covered with bitumen, resembling probably the vessels of bulrushes mentioned by Isaiah. They skimmed over the surface of the water with great rapidity. The tiradas, for so these boats were called by the Arab, drew up along the bank in the open basin before our tents. The largest evidently contained 3 chiefs, who landed and advanced toward me. They were the sons of the Sheikh of the Afaj. Their father had sent them to welcome me to his territories. They brought with them provisions for my caravan, as their village, they said, was still far distant, and it would be impossible to transport our baggage and lead our horses thither before nightfall. The young men were handsome, well-dressed, and well-armed, and very courteous. The complexion of these marsh Arabs, from constant exposure to the intense heat of the sun, is almost black, with the usual contrast of eyes of extraordinary brilliancy and teeth of the whiteness of pearls. They wear their hair in long, well-greased plaits. The young sheikhs had been ordered by their father to remain with me during the night and to place a proper guard around the tents, as the outskirts of the marsh were infested, we were assured, by roving Bedouins and midnight thieves. I gained, as other travelers had done before me, some credit for wisdom and superhuman knowledge by predicting, through the aid of an almanac, a partial eclipse of the moon. It duly took place, to the great dismay of our guests, who well nigh knocked out the bottoms of all my kitchen utensils in their endeavor to frighten away the jinns who had thus laid hold of the planet. Soon after sunrise, the sheikh's own tirada issued from the reeds into the open space. It had been spread with carpets and silk cushions for my reception. The baggage was placed in other boats, but the unfortunate horses, under the guidance of a party of naked Arabs, had to swim the stream and to struggle through the swamp as best they could. The armed men entered their various vessels, and we all left the shore together. The tirada in which I sat was skillfully managed by 2 Arabs with long bamboo poles. It skimmed rapidly over the small lake, and then turned into a broad street cut through green reeds rising 14 or 15 feet on both sides of us. The current, where the vegetation had thus been cleared away, ran at the rate of about 2 miles an hour, and as we were going toward the Euphrates, was against us. We passed the entrances to many lanes, branching off to the right and to the left. From them came black boats filled with Arab men and women carrying the produce of their buffalo herds to the souk or market. Herds of buffaloes here and there struggled and splashed amongst the rushes, their unwieldy bodies completely concealed under water, and their hideous heads just visible on the surface. Occasionally a small plot of ground, scarcely an inch above the level of the marsh, and itself half a swamp, was covered with huts built of reeds, canes, and bright yellow mats. These were the dwellings of the Afaij, and, as we passed by, troops of half-naked men and women and children issued from them and stood on the bank to gaze at the strangers. The lanes now became more crowded with tiradas. The boatmen, however, darted by the heavier vessels, turned the sharp corners, and managed their frail barks with great skill and ease. The openings in the reeds began to be more numerous, and it required a perfect knowledge of the various windings and streets to follow the right way. This singular scene recalled vividly to my mind the sculptures of Kuyunjik, representing the Assyrian wars in marshes of the same nature, and probably formed by the waters of the same river. The streets through the reeds and the tiradas, or boats of rushes smeared with bitumen, are faithfully delineated in the bas-reliefs, showing how little the barbarous inhabitants of these great swamps have changed after the lapse of nearly 3,000 years. If we may judge, however, from the spoil of furniture and vessels of metal, probably of gold and silver, carried away from them by the conquerors, the ancient tribes appear to have been more wealthy and more ingenious than their descendants. Soon after entering a narrow canal, we stopped near some larger and better built huts than any we had yet seen. Before them, at the water's edge, and waiting to receive us, were drawn up a number of armed men, at the head of whom stood a tall, handsome Arab. He was attired in a long robe of scarlet silk of Damascus, over which he wore one of those cloaks richly embroidered in gold thread down the back and one arm, peculiar to Baghdad. This was Agab, Sheikh of the Afaij. As I stepped out of the tirada, he threw his arms round my neck and gave me the usual embrace of welcome. The chief led us at once to the Museif. The guest house was built of the same materials as the smaller cabins, but they were far more tastefully put together. It resembled in shape the boiler of some enormous steam engine. Reeds bound together were bent into arches at regular intervals, and formed a series of ribs, upon which were stretched the choicest mats. About 50 persons could conveniently sit in this hut. In the center was the usual array of bright pots and tiny cups ranged in circular trays round a smoldering fire. A hideous black slave, crouching upon his haunches, was roasting coffee and pounding the fragrant beans in an iron mortar. Down both sides were spread carpets and mats. Soft cushions of figured silk were specially prepared for the European guest. The Museif stood at a short distance from the other huts, and in a corner formed by 2 water streets branching off at right angles. In front of it was the harem of the sheikh. It consisted of several cabins and an enclosure formed entirely by walls of reeds and mats. Beyond was a great collection of huts, and in the middle of them the bazaars, consisting of double rows of shops, all of the same frail materials, so that this Arab town was built entirely of mats and reeds. Agab received me in the most friendly manner, and entered at once into my plans for excavating, describing the ruins existing in the neighborhood. He ordered his people to raise a hut for my servants and the Jabur workmen, and to pitch my tents in the open space opposite the Museum. Building was not a lengthy or difficult process, for the materials were so simple. Within an hour the mats had been dragged from the harem, the bundles of reeds turned into graceful arches, and the cabin duly covered in. As a dwelling place, however, the small island on which the sheikh had thought fit to erect his movable capital was not perhaps the most desirable in the world. Had the Euphrates risen by any sudden flood, we would have been completely under water. My proposition to encamp on the mounds of Nineveh was negatived by Agab on account of the dangers from the Bedouins, evil spirits, beasts of prey, and the like. So I made up my mind to remain at the souk. The sheikh, believing I was in search of gold, was always my attendant with his followers. He knew so many authentic instances of enormous wealth having been dug up at Nineveh that it was useless to argue with him upon the subject. He related to me in the usual expressive manner of the Arabs the following story. In the time of Hatab, the uncle of Wadi, sheikh of the Zubaydah and Camelier of the tribe, chanced to be in Damascus with his camels. As he was walking one day in the bazaar, an aged man accosted him. "O sheikh of the caravan," said he, "I know that thou art from the southern Jazira, and from the land of the Zubaydah. God be praised for sending thee to me. Now there is in that country a great mound that marks the site of an ancient city of the unbelievers called Nineveh. Go, dig in the dry bed of the Chateau Nil in the midst of the ruins, and thou wilt find a stone white as milk. Bring it to me, and thou shalt have a reward double the usual hire for thy camels, both there and back." The camelier was at a loss to guess how the old man knew of the stone, but he did as he had been asked, and in the place described to him he found the white stone, which was just a camel's burden. He took it to Damascus and gave it to the sheikh, who first paid him his just reward, and then broke the stone into pieces before him. It was, of course, full of gold, and the philosopher had learned where it was to be found in the books of the infidels. End of chapter 24, part 1.
Chapter 24, Part 2 of Discoveries Among the Ruins of Nineveh and Babylon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Peter Dann. Discoveries Among the Ruins of Nineveh and Babylon by Austen Layard. Chapter 24, Part 2. Being thus compelled to remain at the souk, I fitted up my tent and cabins as well as I was able. The weather was intensely cold, and it was the middle of the rainy season. By the help of mats, we were able to keep out the water to a certain extent. The excavations were carried on until the 3rd of February, and I will describe at once their general results. Nineveh, as I have already observed, consists rather of a collection of mounds of unequal height and irregular form than of one compact platform like the principal ruins of Assyria. They may be divided into 4 distinct groups, each surrounded and separated from the others by deep ravines, which have the appearance of ancient streets. The high cone at the northeast corner is probably the remains of a square tower, constructed entirely of large sun-dried bricks. Beneath the cone, masonry of sun-dried and kiln-burnt bricks protrudes from the sides of the ravines. The bricks are generally smaller in dimension than those from Babylon, and long and narrow in shape. Many of them are stamped with inscriptions in the Babylonian character, containing the name of a king and of the city. My workmen were divided into gangs or karkanas, as they are called by the Arabs, and were placed in different parts of the ruins. On the first day, some cells or recesses containing human remains were discovered. During the 2 subsequent days we found many vases and jars of earthenware, some glazed and others plain. With these relics was a bowl, unfortunately much broken, covered with ancient Hebrew characters similar to those discovered at Babylon. Fragments of similar vessels were afterwards dug out of the ruins. On the mound of Nineveh, as on other ruins of the same period in this part of Mesopotamia, are found numerous fragments of highly glazed pottery of a rich blue colour, but very coarse and fragile in texture. I was at a loss to conjecture the nature of the objects of which they had originally formed a part, until on the 4th day of the excavations a party of workmen uncovered a coffin or sarcophagus of precisely the same material. Within it were human remains, which crumbled to dust almost soon as exposed to the air. The earthenware was so ill burnt, and had suffered so much from age, that I was unable to remove this coffin entire. It fell to pieces as soon as I endeavoured to detach it from the soil by which it was surrounded. But beneath it was found a second, and subsequently scarcely a day elapsed without the discovery of 4 or 5 similar coffins. The largest were about 6 feet long. Some, containing the remains of children, scarcely exceeded 3. They were all of nearly the same shape, an oval about 2 feet wide for the head and shoulders of the corpse, joined to a narrow box for the legs and feet. The oval was closed by a detached flat lid. The rest of the coffin was covered, and there was a small hole at the very end. The body must consequently have been forced into the sarcophagus from the top or open part. All of these coffins were covered with bright greenish-blue glaze, coloured with copper like that on pottery and bricks from the ruins of Babylon. Some were ornamented with scroll work and other designs, others with rude figures of men and animals in relief. They were all of the same fragile material. The clay, moreover, having been only partially burnt, had been exposed to the action of the nitre so abundant in the soil. Without considerable care it was impossible to remove any entire, although the surrounding earth was easily detached from them. Human remains, more or less perfect, were found in all these sarcophagi. Sometimes, as the lid was carefully removed, I could almost distinguish the body, wrapped in its grave clothes and still lying in its narrow resting place. But no sooner did the outer air reach the empty crust of humanity than it fell away into dust, leaving only the skull and great bones of the arms and legs to show what these now empty cases had once contained. 1 or 2 small cups or vases in the same glazed pottery, and a few beads and engraved gems were occasionally gathered from the crumbling remains, but no ornaments of gold or silver were discovered at Nineveh, though it appears that the Arabs frequently find them in similar coffins from other ruins in southern Mesopotamia. It is remarkable, however, that there were no ornaments whatever in metal in nearly 100 coffins which I opened at Nineveh. It is impossible to estimate the number of these earthen coffins. The upper parts of the mound in some places appeared to consist almost entirely of them. They generally rested one upon the other, but in some cases were separated by a layer of flat bricks or tiles. As fast as the fragments of one were removed, a second appeared beneath it, and notwithstanding the number thus taken away, I did not penetrate many feet beneath the surface. In the lower part of Mesopotamia are many ruins in which similar remains are equally abundant. Fragments of glazed pottery, broken from them, are seen on every ancient site to the south of Babylon. According to Mr. Loftus, the vast mound of Worker is built almost entirely of such coffins, piled one above the other, and consequently many thousands, or rather hundreds of thousands, must exist in it alone. It is difficult to arrive at a very satisfactory conclusion as to the precise date of these remains. My own impression is that they are comparatively modern, that is, that they are to be attributed to a period subsequent to the fall of the Babylonian Empire, extending from the 2nd or 1st century before the Christian era to even the time of the Arab invasion. Colonel Rawlinson entertains, I believe, a different opinion, and would attribute them to a much earlier period. If the great mounds of Nineveh be the remains of a Babylonian city, as they probably are, it is evident that that city must have been completely destroyed, and its ruins covered with earth long before a people, afterwards inhabiting the country, could have buried their dead above them. In one part of the mound, in a kind of recess or small chamber of brick masonry, was discovered a heap of pottery of a yellow colour, very thin and fragile, much resembling that still made at Baghdad to hold water in hot weather. Many vases and cups were still entire. With them were fragments of glass bottles, jars, and other vessels, and several highly glazed or enamelled dishes. These relics appeared to be of the same period as the sarcophagi. A large number of coarse jars or urns, some nearly 6 feet high, were dug out of various parts of the mound. They contained bones of men and animals, and their mouths had been carefully closed by a tile or brick plastered with bitumen. Although many deep trenches were opened in the ruins, and in the conical mound at the northeast corner, no other remains or relics were discovered. With the exception of a few massive foundations and the bricks bearing a cuneiform superscription, I much doubt whether anything found at Nineveh was of the true Babylonian period. The Arabs have a story that a great black stone exists somewhere in the ruins. I had once conjectured that it might be the identical obelisk said to have been brought by Semiramis from Armenia to Babylon. After I had searched in vain for it, I was assured that it was near some mounds several miles to the east of Nineveh. I sent a party of workmen to the spot, but with no better success. On the whole, I am much inclined to question whether extensive excavations carried on at Nineveh would produce any very important or interesting results. In the Afaj Bazaar I was able to purchase a few relics from the Arabs. They consisted chiefly of cylinders and engraved gems. But even such remains were far more scarce than I had anticipated. A ram in baked clay with 3 holes for holding colours or ointments, apparently Babylonian, and a pebble of white marble on which are rudely engraved 2 goats before the sacred tree, and a few cuneiform characters, were brought to me from some neighbouring ruin. Such were all the antiquities I obtained during my visit to Nineveh. With the pottery collected at the mound, they are now in the British Museum. One of my principal objects in journeying into these wild tracts in southern Mesopotamia was to visit and explore the great mound of Worka. These remains had already been partly examined, as I have stated, by Mr. Loftus. A highly interesting collection of relics, comprising inscribed clay tablets, glazed pottery, ornaments in metal and engraved gems, had been obtained by that gentleman during his short residence among the ruins. They are now in the British Museum. Amongst them, and deserving particular notice, are the fragments of a shell on which are engraved the heads of 2 horses, apparently part of a subject representing a warrior in his chariot. The outline upon them is not without spirit, but they are principally remarkable for being almost identical with a similar engraved shell found in an Etruscan tomb, and now in the British Museum. This is not the only instance, as it has been seen, of relics from Assyria and Etruria being of the same character, showing a close connection between the 2 countries, either direct or by mutual intercourse with some intermediate nation. Unfortunately, the state of the country to the south of the marshes was such that I was unable even to make an attempt to reach the remarkable ruins of Worka. The great Arab tribe of Montefic, dwelling on the banks of the lower Euphrates and exercising a certain control over all the smaller tribes inhabiting the southern part of Mesopotamia, was split into opposite factions on account of the rival pretensions of 2 chiefs. Much blood had already been spilt, and the war was now extending to the Afaj. The surrounding tribes, taking advantage of the general confusion and of the unsuccessful attempt of the Pasha to subdue the Maidan Arabs, had openly rebelled against the government and were laying waste the province and plundering each other. It was, indeed, scarcely possible even to leave the Afaj territory, and Agab, who, like all the other Arab sheiks, was not without his rival, began to fear an outbreak among his own people. He had already been summoned to take part in the war between the two Montefique chiefs, and he was anxious that I should be on safe ground before his troubles commenced. He therefore seriously urged me to return to Baghdad. The sheikh, with some other chiefs of his tribe, was accustomed to pass the evening in my tent. He would, on these occasions, describe the unsettled and dangerous state of the country, and lament the insecurity caused by the misrule of the Turkish authorities. At the same time, he would entertain me with accounts of the districts to the south of the Afaj, their productions and the manners of the curious populations inhabiting those vast marshes. The greater part of the country below ancient Babylon has now been for centuries one great swamp. It is indeed what the prophet foretold it should be, a desert of the sea. The embankments of the rivers, utterly neglected, have broken away, and the waters have spread over the face of the land. The best known of these marshes are the Lemlud, formed by the Euphrates above its confluence with the Tigris at Korna. But they now only form a part of those which are yearly increasing and threaten to cover the whole of southern Mesopotamia. The Arab tribes inhabiting them are, as I have already observed, among the most wild and ignorant that can be found in this part of Asia. The relations between them and the Porta have generally consisted of little more than a trial of treachery and deceit, and while the Turk looks upon these Arabs as mere wild beasts, they in return have lost all confidence in the faith and honour of the Ottoman government. But it is not so with respect to the English, who have always treated them honourably and kindly, and whom consequently they have allowed to pass to and fro without harm. This respect for the British name is mainly to be attributed to the admirable conduct and management of Captain Jones during the time he has commanded the steamer on the Tigris. These Arabs are of the Shia sect of Mussulmans and belong to the great tribes of Rubi'a and Al-Maidan. Each tribe has innumerable subdivisions with distinct names and separate and independent sheikhs. They live in mat huts and in small black tents. Their chief wealth consists in vast herds of buffaloes, and they are, on the whole, notwithstanding the wretched appearance of their dwellings and the scanty clothing of both men and women, richer than most Arab tribes. This is to be attributed to their having hitherto been able, in their almost inaccessible retreats, to defy the Turkish authorities. Their buffaloes supply them with large quantities of butter and milk. The former is exported and is a considerable article of trade. These hideous animals appear to thrive in the marshy lands, and some districts actually swarm with them. They are generally inoffensive and easily managed. These tribes have also flocks of sheep and goats, but the animals are small and their wool thin, and generally too coarse to form an article of commerce. They raise very little corn and barley. Rice of an inferior quality forms their principal food. The marshes and the jungles near the rivers are the retreats of many kinds of wild animals. Lions abound. I have seen them frequently, and during the excavations at Nineveh we found fresh traces of their footsteps almost daily among the ruins. The Maidan Arabs boast of capturing them in the following manner, and trustworthy persons have assured me that they have seen the feat performed. A man, having bound his right arm with strips of tamarisk, and holding in his hand a strong piece of the same wood, about a foot or more in length, hardened in the fire and sharpened at both ends, will advance boldly into the animal's lair. When the lion springs upon him, he forces the wood into the animal's extended jaws, which will then be held open, whilst he can dispatch the astonished beast at his leisure with the pistol that he holds in his left hand. In the jungles are also found leopards, lynxes, wild cats, wolves, hyenas, jackals, deer, porcupines, boars in vast numbers, and other animals. Wild fowl, cranes, and bustards abound, and that beautiful game bird, the francolin or black partridge, swarms in the low brushwood. The Arabs shoot them with ball. The marshes are full of fish, which attain a considerable size. They are chiefly, I believe, a kind of barbel. Their flesh is coarse and full of bones, but they afford the Arabs a constant supply of food. They are generally taken by the spear. Although the inhabitants of the marshes recognise some of the laws of the Bedouins, they are wanting in many of the virtues of the Arabs of the desert. They have, however, several customs relating to the duties of hospitality which are rigidly adhered to. To say of a Maidan that he has sold bread is to offer him the greatest of insults. To part with a loaf for money is accounted an act bringing disgrace not only upon the perpetrator but upon his whole family. I found this peculiar custom exceedingly inconvenient during my residence among the Afage. Sheikh Agab insisted upon giving daily to my large party their supplies of bread, and it was impossible to obtain it in any other manner. Even its sale in the public market was forbidden. I was, at length, compelled to send to a considerable distance for flour, and then to employ my own workmen in baking it. The same scruples do not exist with regard to other articles of food. They are sold in the bazaar, as in all eastern towns. In the souk or bazaar of the Afage tribe were exposed for sale a few common Manchester prints, those worldwide evidences of the extent of British trade, English stuffs printed and dyed at Baghdad called tanjebs, keffis, Damascus silks, striped dabbas, dates, rice, coffee, spices, powder and arms, the usual stores of an eastern market. A few Christian jewellers fashion gold and silver ornaments for the women, and an occasional peddler from Hilla or Baghdad excites the admiration of the Arabs by the display of a stock of coarse knives and common European hardware. The dampness of the soil upon which my tent was pitched, and the unwholesome air of the surrounding marshes, brought on a severe attack of pleurisy and fever. I was soon unable to move from my bed, and was reduced at length to a state of extreme weakness. Fortunately, it occurred to me to use a blistering fluid given to me for an injured horse, or I should probably not have left the Afage swamps. Notwithstanding the severity of the remedy, it gave me immediate relief, and when Hormuzd joined me on the 28th of January, I resolved to make an attempt without further delay to reach Baghdad, where I could obtain medical aid. To add to our misfortunes, the rain fell in unceasing torrents for 4 days, and of course soon made its way through our tents. The waters of the marsh began to rise perceptibly, and the Afage were preparing to abandon their mat huts and to seek in their light taradas a safer retreat. Some days elapsed, however, before I could rise from my carpet. The state of affairs was daily getting worse. Abd Pasha had been suddenly deprived of his government by the Porta on account of the failure of his expedition against the Khazai Arabs, and his fall had increased the general anarchy. It was only by joining a large party of horsemen on their way to the seat of war in the south that Hormuzd had been able to reach Nineveh. I found that it was quite impossible to penetrate further into Mesopotamia, and that by remaining much longer among the Afage we ran the risk of being cut off from Baghdad altogether. I determined therefore to strike once more into the desert, where we were less likely to meet with hostile Arabs than in the beaten tracks, and to make a forced march to some village in the neighbourhood of Hilla. Fortunately, I had my own riding horse with me, and his easy paces enabled me to undertake the journey, although in a state of complete exhaustion. On the 2nd of February I took leave of Agab and pitched my tents for the night beneath the mounds of Nineveh. Before dawn on the following morning we were urging our horses over the desert plains of the centre of Mesopotamia. 2 armed adherents of the sheik were with us, rather to act as guides than to protect us from enemies. We travelled without any cause for alarm as far as the great ruin of Zeprina-Jaz. A large body of horsemen then suddenly appeared in the distance. We ascended the mound and prepared to defend ourselves from this elevated position. But either the Arabs did not perceive us, or were bent upon some warlike expedition which did not admit of delay, for they passed onwards and left us to continue our journey. Zeprina closely resembles the celebrated ruin of Akakaf near Baghdad. It rises from a heap of rubbish in the centre of the desert and consists of a solid mass of large, crumbling, sun-dried bricks, between the courses of which, at certain intervals, are layers of reeds, as in many of the Babylonian buildings. We saw no human habitation until long after nightfall, when we reached the small Arab hamlet of Bashai. It was surrounded for defence by a low mud wall, and some time was spent in a parley and explanation before the timid inhabitants would open their gates to so large a company of strangers. I could hardly remain in my saddle until their fears were set at rest, and we were admitted within the enclosure. At length I tottered into a hovel thick with smoke, and sank down exhausted after a ride of 14 hours and a fortnight's complete abstinence from food. My poor Jabur workmen, being on foot, had been unable to keep up with the caravan during our forced march. They did not reach the village until daybreak, and then in a very sorry plight, for they were stripped to the skin. They had approached, in search of water, the tents of some Arabs, and falling in with a plundering party had been robbed of everything and left naked in the desert. Next morning I had scarcely strength to mount my horse. Hormuzd turned off to Hilla to put a stop to the excavations at Babylon. With the caravan I made another forced march in the beaten track to Baghdad, and reached the Khan of Iskandariya. We were now within a few hours of the end of our journey, and leaving the servants and baggage to follow at leisure, I quitted the Khan with the Bayraktar before dawn to canter into Baghdad. As the sun rose from the sea-like plain, the great ruin of Ctesiphon appeared above the eastern horizon. This ruin, with a few mounds and heaps of rubbish scattered about it, is all that now remains of the capital of the Parthian Empire. On the opposite banks of the Tigris, long lines of earthen ramparts, forming a quadrangle and enclosing the usual signs of former habitations, mark the site of the city built by Seleucus after the last fall of Babylon. The victorious Arabs under Saad, the general of the Caliph Omar, pillaged Ctesiphon after they had overthrown the Persian armies in the decisive battle of Qadisiyah in the 16th year of the Hegira. They found in the palace the throne, the crown, and the standard of the Persian kings, together with a carpet which covered the floor of the great hall, and was of such extraordinary beauty and value that it excited the wonder of the conquerors, and was considered among the most precious spoil taken from their enemies. Ctesiphon and Seleucia received from the Arabs the name of Al-Madain, or the Twin Cities. When Baghdad was founded on the Tigris, a few miles above them, the Caliph al-Mansur wished to pull down the palace of Khosrows for materials to build his own capital. His vizier, who had recently turned from the Magian religion, endeavoured to dissuade him. The Caliph upbraided him for being but an insincere convert to Islam, and for sympathizing with those who still professed his former faith, and whose monuments he therefore wished to preserve. The attempt to destroy the vast edifice was fruitless, but when it was about to be abandoned, the vizier urged his master to persevere, exclaiming that if he now ceased to pull down the palace, history would say that al-Mansur, with all his power, was unable to overthrow that which another prince had built. I did not visit Ctesiphon on this occasion. The river separated me from the ruins, and I only mention them in this place to describe a remarkable effect of mirage which I witnessed as I rode towards Baghdad. As the quivering sun rose in unclouded splendour, the palace was transformed into a vast arcade of enormous arches resting upon columns and masses of masonry. Gradually this arcade was, as it were, compressed like the slides of a telescope, but the building gained in height what it lost in length, and one arch slowly appeared above the other, until the ruin assumed the shape of a tower reaching to the sky, and pierced from the base to the summit by innumerable arches. In a few minutes this strange edifice began to melt away into the air, and I saw a magnified though perfect image of the palace, but upon it was its exact counterpart upside down. Other equally singular changes succeeded until the sun was high in the heavens, and the ruins at length disappeared in the distance. The small bushes of camel thorn scattered over the desert were during this time turned into forest trees, and a transparent lake imaged for a fleeting hour in its counterfeit waters the varying forms of the insubstantial edifice. Although I have seen many extraordinary effects of mirage during my wanderings in the East, I scarcely remember to have witnessed one more striking or more beautiful than that near the ruins of Ctesiphon. I had just strength left me to reach the gates of Baghdad. Once in the city, under the friendly care of Dr. Hislop, I soon recovered my health and was ready to start on fresh adventures. End of chapter 24.
Chapter 25, Part 1 of Discoveries Among the Ruins of Nineveh and Babylon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wilma, Magastino. Discoveries Among the Ruins of Nineveh and Babylon by Austen Layard. Chapter 25, Part 1. There was no hope of improvement in the state of the country round Baghdad. The Pasha had left the dam of the Hindia, which shortly after again gave way and afforded fresh retreats to the Arabs. Under these circumstances, and for other reasons, I deem it prudent to give up for the time the excavations in the ruins of Babylonia. When tranquillity had been to some extent restored in the Pashalik, an expedition might be undertaken either by myself or by some other traveller, with better prospects of success. The Shamar Bedouins were now moving northwards, towards their spring and summer pastures. I had been in continual communication with the sons of Rishwan. Satam, whose wife's imperious temper still kept him apart from his family, had encamped during the winter with another branch of the tribe in the neighborhood of Tekrit. It was suspected that he had been privy to more than one successful attack on the Turkish post, and on certain treasure convoys belonging to the government. The roads between Baghdad and Mosul were completely closed by bands of Bedouins, who plundered every caravan that came within their reach. Sahiman and Michele had accompanied their father to the plains of southern Babylonia. The latter had been severely wounded in some affray. As Sahiman was journeying northwards with the rest of his tribe, I thought this a good opportunity of following under his protection the direct track to Mosul through the desert and along the western bank of the Tigris. He at once consented to escort me, only stipulating that I should obtain permission from the Pasha for his camels and flocks to pass through the suburbs of Baghdad, instead of following the longer and more difficult road through the marshes, like those of the rest of the tribe. The request was granted, and a guarantee was given to me by the governor and the commander-in-chief of the troops that my Bedouin friend, with his family and property, should cross the city in safety. They had no sooner, however, entered the gates than they were fallen upon by inhabitants of the quarter, aided by a body of irregular troops and Agalis. Abandoning nearly 800 camels, Sahiman and his brother Arabs fled into the desert. Warmly supported by Captain Kimball, I remonstrated indignantly against this act of treachery. The Turkish authorities declared that it was an accident beyond their control, and at length adopted means to recover the stolen camels. It was, however, with some difficulty that I was able to find Sahiman, and then to induce him to return to Baghdad. Eventually the greater part of his property was restored to him. It is thus that the Bedouins are encouraged in continual enmity to the Porte, and that their reliance to the good faith of the Turks and of the inhabitants of towns has been completely destroyed. This untimely occurrence, as well as repeated attacks of fever, delayed my departure for some days, and it was not until the 27th of February that, bidding adieu to my good friends of Baghdad, I crossed the Tigris by the crazy bridge of boats and took the crowded road to Katime. There I passed the night beneath the hospitable roof of the Nawab of Oud. At daybreak on the following morning, under the guidance of Sahiman and accompanied by Hormuz, the Jebus, and my servants, I left the sacred suburb, and followed the beaten track leading to the desert. In order to avoid the windings of the river, we struck across the barren plain. The low houses of Acmain soon disappeared from our sight, but for some miles we watched the gilded domes and minarets of the tombs of the imams, rising above the dark-belled palms and glittering in the rays of the morning sun. At last they too vanished, and I had looked for the last time upon Baghdad. We were now in as complete a wilderness as if we had been wandering in the midst of Arabia, and not within a few miles of a great city. Not a living creature broke the solitude. Here and there we saw the sites of former encampments, but the Arabs had long since left them, either to move further into the desert or to seek security from an enemy amongst the date groves in the banks of the river. We travelled with speed over the plain, and after a ride of 9 hours we found ourselves in the midst of the palm trees of a village called Sumaika, formerly a town of some importance, and still watered by the Dujal, a wide and deep canal of the time of the caliphs, derived from the Tigris. The inhabitants, seeing horsemen in the distance, mistook us for enemies, but finding that we were travellers and friends, they escorted us to the house of the Sheikh Hashem, who immediately slew a sheep and made other hospitable preparations for our entertainment. This chief, although now ruling over a stationary tribe who till the soil, is of Shamar descent, and is married to a Bedouin lady. As his wife, however, will not condescend to live within 4 walls, he is obliged to compromise matters by passing 1/2 of the year under her tent, and the other in his hovel amongst his own people. As we expected to fall in with her tribe during our journey northwards, he entrusted me with a bundle of embroidered cloaks and coloured kerchiefs as presents to her and her kin. His missive was crowded with Bedouins, for amongst the Arabs the hospitality of Hashem had become a proverb. Sumaika, too, being on the edge of the desert, is convenient for hearing news from the town, and as a place of meeting before or after plundering expeditions. Although a Turkish mutir, with a garrison of dozen half-starved Albanians, resides within the walls of his ruined city. The plain on all sides is intersected by the remains of innumerable canals and watercourses, derived from the Tigris and the Dujal. Their lofty banks narrowed the view, and it was only as we passed over them, after quitting Sumaika, that we saw the distant palm groves of the large village of Bennett. We left the village to the right, and passed through the ruins of an Arab town of the time of the caliphs. Beyond it we crossed the Dujal, by a falling bridge of 4 large arches, with a small arc between each. The beauty of the masonry, the ornamental inscriptions, and rich tracery of this ruin showed that it was of the best period of Arab architecture. To the north of the Dujal we found through a perfect maze of ancient canals now dry. It required the practised eye of the Bedouin to follow the sand-covered track. About 8 miles beyond the bridge, the embankment suddenly ceased. A high rampart of earth then stretched as far as the eye could see, to the right and to the left. At certain distances were mounds, forming square enclosures like ruined outworks. A few 100 yards in advance was a second rampart, much lower and narrower than the first. We had reached what some believed to be the famous Median Wall, one of the many wonders of Babylonia, built by the Babylonians from river to river across Mesopotamia, to guard their wealthy city and thickly peopled provinces against invasion from the north. Captain Jones, however, who has examined these remains with more care and for a greater distance than any other traveller, or than I could do during a hasty journey, is of opinion that they are not those of a wall of defence, but merely of an embankment, stretching for miles inland, and originally raised to protect the lower country from inundations, and to regulate its irrigation. I confess that my own impression, even after this explanation, was in favor of the rampart. At any rate, if this be not the Median Wall, no traces of which have been as yet found in any other part of Mesopotamia, it appeared to me to be a regular line of fortification. It is called by the Arabs, at the place we crossed it, Faria, elsewhere the Cedar al-Nimrud or the Rampart of Nimrud. Beyond the Median Wall, we entered upon undulating gravelly downs, furrowed by deep ravines, and occasional rising into low hills. With the rich alluvial soil of Babylonia, we had left the boundaries of the ancient province. The banks of the Tigris are here, in general, too high, and the face of the country too unequal, to admit of artificial irrigation being carried far inland by watercourses derived from the river. The spiral tower, the dome, and the minarets of Samarra at length appeared above the eastern horizon, and we rode towards them. After 9 hours and a half's journey, we encamped for the night on the Tigris opposite to the town. As the sun went down, we watched the women who, on the other side of the river, came to fetch their evening supplies of water, and gracefully bearing their pitchers on their heads, returned to the gates. But on our bank, the solitude was only broken by a lonely hyena coming to drink at the stream, and the hungry jackals that prowled round our tents. The ruins of an early Arab town called the Sheikh stood on a hill in the distance, and near our camping place were the deserted walls of a more recent settlement. On the third day of our journey, another ride of 9 hours and a half, along the banks of the Tigris, brought us to Tikrit. The Arabs were keeping the small town of Tikrit in a state of siege, and its supplies having been cut off, we had some difficulty in getting provisions for ourselves and our horses. We were not sorry to leave Tikrit, whose inhabitants did not belie a notorious bad character. Next morning we struck inland, in order to avoid the precipitous hills of Makul, at whose very feet sweeps the Tigris. They form part of a long isolated limestone range, which commences with the Sinjar, runs through the center of Mesopotamia, crosses the river near Khan Karnaini, then takes the name of Amrin, and approaching the mountains of Luristan, continues parallel with them to the Persian province of Fars. In the Makul hills are several ruins, some falling walls, and towers hanging over the Tigris, and once probably the stronghold of a freebooter, who levied blackmail on the travelers, are called by the Arabs the Castle of the Giants, and are said to be the dwelling place of jinns and various other supernatural beings. Our track led through a perfect wilderness. We found no water, nor saw any moving thing. When, after a long ride of about 11 hours, we reached some brackish springs called Belilis, the complete solitude lulled us into a feeling of security, and we all slept without keeping the accustomed watch. I was awoke in the middle of the night by an unusual noise close to my tent. I immediately gave the alarm, but it was too late. 2 of our horses had been stolen, and in the darkness we could not pursue the thieves. Sahiman broke out in reproaches of himself as the cause of our mishap, and wandered about until dawn in search of some clue to the authors of the theft. At length he tracked them, declared unhesitatingly that they were of the Shamar, pointed out from marks almost imperceptible to any eye but to that of a Bedouin, that they were 4 in number, had left their delows at some distance from our tents, and had already journeyed far before they had been drawn by our fires to the encampment. These indications were enough. He swore an oath that he would follow and bring back our stolen horses, wherever they might be, for it was a shame upon him and his tribe that, whilst under his protection in the desert, we had lost anything belonging to us, and he religiously kept his oath. When we parted at the end of our journey, he began at once to trace the animals. After 6 weeks' search, during which he went as far as Anna on the Euphrates, where one had been sold to an Arab of the town. He brought them to Mosul. I was away at the time, but he left them with Mr. Rassam, and returned to the desert without asking a reward for performing an act of duty imperative on a Bedouin. Such instances of honesty and good faith are not uncommon amongst the wandering Arabs, as I can bear witness from personal experience. Mr. Rassam frequently sends to them across the desert with as much as 500 or 600 pounds in money, and always with the most complete confidence. His only reward was an occasional silk dress, or 1 or 2 camel loads of corn for his family, the whole of the value of a few shillings. Of late years, the wool of the Bedouin sheep has been in considerable demand in the European markets, and a large trade in this article has already been opened with the shamar. Money is generally advanced some months before the sheep are sheared, to enable the Arabs to buy their winter stock of provisions. Mr. Rassam has thus paid beforehand several £1,000 without any written or other guarantee whatever. The tribes leave the neighborhood of the town, and are not again heard of until their long strings of camels are seen bringing the promised wool. I remember a Bedouin coming all the way, alone from the neighborhood of Baghdad, to pay Mr. Rassam a trifling sum, I think between 3 and 4 shillings, the balance of a wool account between them. A youth of the great tribe of Aneza, having quarrelled with his parents, ran away and came to Mosul, when he entered as a student in a college. He became a mullah, and had almost forgotten his early friends, when the tribe, driven by a famine from the Syrian desert, crossed the Euphrates, and encamped near the town to buy corn. Ibn Geshish, their sheikh, hearing by chance that the fugitive was still alive, and now a member of the priesthood, sent a messenger to him to say that since he had quitted his tents, his father had died, and had left a certain number of camels, which had been divided according to the law amongst his family. Those allotted to him had been in the safe keeping of the tribe, and had increased yearly. The chief was now ready to do with them as the rightful owner might direct. Mr. Rassam had, at my request, sent a party of Jebus to renew the excavations at Kalashurjat, which had been very imperfectly examined. The springs of Belialis are separated from the shoulder of the Jebel Nakul, which overhangs the ruins, by a wild rocky valley called Wadi Jahannam, the Valley of Hell. We crossed it and the hills in about 3 hours and a half, and came suddenly upon the workmen, who, of course, took us for Bedouin plunderers, and prepared to defend themselves. They had opened trenches in various parts of the great mound, but had made no discoveries of any importance, and I am inclined to doubt whether an edifice containing any number of sculptures or inscriptions ever existed on the platform. Fragments of a mean bull in the alabaster of the Nineveh palaces, part of a statue in black stone with a few cuneiform characters, and pieces of a large inscribed slab of copper, were found in the ruins. I collected also the fragments of a large inscribed cylinder in baked clay, and a copper cup, a few vases in common pottery, and some beads. We encamped in the jungle to the north of the ruins, and were visited by 15 men of the Abu Muhammad, who frankly confessed that they were thieves, out on their vocation. As the tribe does not bear a very good character for honesty, and as it might have struck our guests that they had no need of going further to fulfill the object of their journey, we violated the duties of hospitality, and put some of them in irons for the night as a guarantee for the good conduct of the rest. I ordered the Jebus to leave Kalashurjat, and to return with us to Mosul, which we reached the following day. Mr. Bell, who had been sent to Assyria by the trustees of the British Museum to succeed Mr. Cooper as artist to the expedition, had arrived in the town 2 days before. I rode with him without delay to Koyunjik, to examine the excavations made during my absence. I will now describe the sculptures uncovered whilst I was at Baghdad, and after my return to Mosul. previous to my departure for England. To the north of the great centre hall, 4 new chambers had been discovered. The first was 96 feet by 23. On its walls were represented the return of an Assyrian army from war, with their spoil of captives and cattle. The prisoners were distinguished by a cap turned back at the top, not unlike the Phrygian bonnet reversed, short tunics, and a broad belt. The women had long curls falling over their shoulders, and were clothed in fringed robes. The fighting men of the conquered tribe wore a simple fillet round their short hair, a tunic, falling in front to the knee, and behind, to the calf of the leg, a wavy girdle, and a cross belt round their breast, ending in 2 large tassels. A kneeling camel, receiving its load, was designed with considerable truth and spirit, the legs bent under, the tail raised, the foot of the man on the neck of the animal, to keep it from rising, whilst a second adjusts the burden from behind, form a group seen every day in the desert and in an eastern town. The camel saddle, too, nearly resembled that still used by the Arabs. This chamber opened at one end into a small room, 23 feet by 13. On its walls were represented a captive tribe, dressed in short tunics, a skin falling from their shoulders, boots laced up in front, and cross bands round their legs. They had short bushy hair and beards. In the outer chamber 2 doorways opposite the grand entrances into the great hall led into a parallel apartment, 62 feet by 16 feet. On its walls was represented the conquest of the same people, wearing the reverse Phrygian bonnet. There were long lines of prisoners, some in carts, others on foot. The fighting men, armed with bows and quivers, were made to bear part of the spoil. In the costumes of the warriors and captives, and in the forms of the wagons and war carts, these bas-reliefs bore a striking resemblance to the sculptures of the son of Esarhaddon, described in a previous chapter. It may therefore be inferred that the conquest of the same nation was celebrated in both, and that on these walls we have recorded the successful wars of Sennacherib in the country of Sushana or Elam. This chamber, like the one parallel to it, led at one end into a small room, 17 feet square. On its walls, the campaign recorded in the adjoining chamber had been continued. These rooms completed the discoveries on the southern side of the palace. On the northern side of the same edifice, and on the river face of the platform, one wall of a third great hall had been uncovered. The other walls had not been excavated at the time of my departure from Mosul. From the very ruinous state of this part of the building, and from the small accumulation of earth above the level of the foundations, it is doubtful whether any sculpture still exists in it. The standing wall had 3 entrances, the center formed by winged lions, and the others by fish gods. Of the bas-reliefs only fragments now remained. In one set was depictured the conquest of another tribe, dwelling in the marshes of southern Mesopotamia. The Assyrians pursued their enemies in wicker boats, such as I have described in my account of the fight of Arabs, on the islands formed by the small streams flowing through the marshes, were Assyrian warriors on horseback. On the same side of the hall was represented the conquest of a second nation, whose men were clothed in long garments, and whose women wore turbans with veils falling to their feet. The Assyrians had plundered their temples, and were seen carrying away their idols. Of a truth, Lord, the kings of Assyria have laid waste all the nations and their countries, and have cast their gods into the fire, for they were no gods, but the work of men's hands, wood and stone, therefore they have destroyed them. Unfortunately, the bas-reliefs were so much injured that the nature of these images could not be satisfactorily ascertained. The figures appeared to be beardless, with the exception of one, which is that of a man raising his right arm and bearing a mace. The 3 entrances led into one chamber, 86 feet by 24. On its calcined walls were only the faint traces of bas-reliefs. I could distinguish a line of chariots in a ravine between mountains, warriors throwing logs on a great burning pile of wood, castles on the tops of hills, Assyrians carrying away spoil, amongst which was a royal umbrella, and the king on his throne receiving his army on their return from battle with the captives and booty. Opposite to, and corresponding with the 3 entrances, from the hall were 3 other doorways, leading into a parallel chamber of somewhat smaller dimensions. Parts of 4 slabs were the only sculptures sufficiently well preserved to be drawn. They represented the siege of a great city, whose many towered walls were defended by slingers, archers, and spearmen. The king himself in his chariot was present at the attack. Around him were his warriors and his led horses. 3 more chambers were discovered in this part of the building. They were on the very edge of the river face of the mound. The walls of the outer room had been almost entirely destroyed. An entrance, formed by colossal winged figures, led from it into a second chamber, about 24 feet square, in which the sculptures were still partly preserved. Among the bas-reliefs was another, battle in a marsh. The Assyrian warriors were seen fighting in boats, and bringing their captives to the shore, one of the vessels being towed by a man swimming on an inflated skin. Sennacherib himself, in his chariot, in the midst of a grove of palm trees, received the prisoners and the heads of the slain. Above him was a short epigraph, which appears to read, Sennacherib, king of the country of Assyria, the spoil of the river Agami, from the city of Zeprina. The last line not interpreted. Although the name of this city has not yet been found, as far as I know, in the records on the bulls and on other monuments of the same king, yet the mention of the river enables us to recognize in the bas-reliefs a representation of part of the campaign undertaken by Sennacherib in the 4th year of his reign against Sisebira the Chaldean, whose capital was Bethel, on the same stream. Although the river itself has not as yet been identified, it is evidently either a part of the Tigris or Euphrates, or one of their confluents near the Persian Gulf. We have no difficulty, indeed, in determining the site of the country whose conquest is depictured. The marshes and palm trees show that it must have been in southern Mesopotamia, or in the districts watered by the Shatt el-Arab. A great retinue of charioteers and horsemen appear to have followed Sennacherib to this war. Large circular shields were fixed to the sides of the chariots represented in the sculptures. The 3rd chamber, entered from that last described through a doorway guarded by colossal eagle-footed figures, contained the sculptured records of the conquest of part of Babylonia, or of some other district to the south of it. Long lines of chariots, horsemen, and warriors, divided into companies according to their arms and their costume, accompanied the king. The Assyrians, having taken the principal city of the invaded country, cut down the palm trees within and without its walls. Men beating drums, such as are still seen in the same country, and women clapping their hands in cadence to their song, came out to greet the conquerors. Beneath the walls was represented a great cauldron, which appears to have been supported upon metal images of oxen. Perhaps a vessel resembling the brazen sea of the Temple of Solomon. Such were the discoveries in the ruined palace of Sennacherib at the time of my departure for Europe. In this magnificent edifice I had opened no less than 71 holes, chambers, and passages, whose walls, almost without an exception, had been panelled with slabs of sculptured alabaster, recording the wars, the triumphs, and the great deeds of the Assyrian king. By a rough calculation, about 9,880 feet, or nearly 2 miles, of bas-reliefs with 27 portals, formed by colossal winged bulls and lion sphinxes, were uncovered in that part alone of the building explored during my researches. The greatest length of the excavations was about 720 feet, the greatest breadth about 600 feet. The pavement of the chambers was from 20 to 35 feet below the surface of the mound. Only a part, however, of the palace has been explored, and much still remains underground of this enormous structure. Since my return to Europe, other rooms and sculptures have been discovered. End of Chapter 25, Part 1. Recording by Wilma Magastino. Chapter 25, Part 2 of Discoveries Among the Ruins of Nineveh and Babylon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wilma Magastino. Discoveries Among the Ruins of Nineveh and Babylon by Austen Layard. Chapter 25, Part 2. The excavations were not limited to the corner of Koyunjik containing the palace. Deep trenches and tunnels were opened, and experimental shafts sunk in various parts of the mound. Enormous walls and foundations of brick masonry, fragments of sculptured and unsculptured alabaster, inscribed bricks, numerous small objects, and various other remains were discovered. To the north of the ruins, in the same level, and resting upon a pavement of limestone slabs, were found 4 circular pedestals. They appeared to form a part of a double line of similar objects, extending from the edge of the platform to one entrance to the palace, and may have supported the wooden columns of a covered way, or have served as bases to an avenue of statues. The earth not having been sufficiently cleared away around them, I was unable to ascertain whether there was more than a double row. They were amongst the very few architectural remains dug out at Nineveh. The ornament upon them is not inelegant, and is somewhat Saracenic in its character. I will now describe some of the most interesting small objects discovered in the earth and rubbish during the excavations at Koyunjik. It must be borne in mind that the mound within which was the buried palace was used more than once, and by more than one distinct people, for the site of a castle, if not of a town. We know that Nineveh was utterly destroyed by the united armies of the Medes and Babylonians, yet we find Meherdates taking the castle of Ninus, and the same place is mentioned by several later authors. Coins of more than one Roman emperor were, according to the superscription, struck at Nineveh. One bears the head of Trajan, and on the reverse the legend Augustus Feli Nini Club, round an eagle with expanded wings between 2 military standards. Another has, on one side, the head of Emperor Maximinus, and on the reverse a naked figure, holding an object resembling a bull's head in one hand, with the legend Colonel Nineveh Club. It would appear from these coins that Claudius, who established many colonies in the East, was the founder of one called after him, Nineveh Claudiopolis. As buildings thus appear to have been erected at various times on the mound, we accordingly find in the rubbish remains of various periods. Amongst the relics occasionally brought to me by the workmen were a few fragments of pottery, and coins, and ill-cut gems with inscriptions in the Pahlavi character of the time of the Sasanian kings of Persia, that is, from the first half of the 3rd to the 7th century after Christ. Of the Roman period, we have terracotta figures and lamps, and a hoard of 89 silver denarii of the emperors Vespasian, Titus, Domitian, Trajan, Antoninus Pius, Marcus Aurelius, Lucius Verus, Commodus, and Septimius Severus, according to the dates on the coins themselves, from 1874 to 8201. Mr. R. Stuart Poole of the British Museum, to whom I am indebted for a list and description of these coins, conjectures with much probability that they were buried by a Roman soldier during the second expedition undertaken by Severus against the Arabs of Mesopotamia in 8202, or during the Parthian War, carried on by the same emperor. The number of coins of Commodus, and the fact that there are none of any emperor after Severus, led to the belief that the hoard was buried about this time. It is worthy of remark, too, that the latest have few, if any, marks of having been in circulation. Unfortunately, there are no coins amongst them actually struck at Nineveh, although they mostly belong to eastern cities. Of the time of the Seleucidae and of the Greek occupation of Assyria and Babylonia, we have several relics. Amongst them a small head of Hercules, with the eyes inlaid in ivory, 1 or 2 figures in terracotta, some copper and glass vessels, and various objects in pottery and bronze. To this period I am now inclined to attribute the earthen sarcophagi, the great jars, and other sepulchral remains found at Nimrud, Kalashargat, Koyunjik, and in other Assyrian mounds, which, when my former work was written, I believed to belong to a much earlier epoch. Since my return to England, Mr. Vice-Consul Rassam has discovered at Koyunjik several tombs built of slabs of stone, and apparently of even a later date, for in one of them I understand was found a gold coin of the Emperor Maximinus. They contain, however, very interesting relics in the same precious metal and in glass. It is remarkable that, notwithstanding the most careful search, in all parts of the country around Mosul, I have been unable to find one undoubted Assyrian tomb, nor can I conjecture how or where the people of Nineveh buried their dead. The sepulchral chambers in the hills, so frequently described in these pages, are unquestionably of a comparatively late period. The rocky gulls outside and between the enclosure walls of Koyunjik have been examined over and over again with the greatest care for traces of tombs, but in vain. In the numerous isolated conical mounds scattered over the face of the country, I have detected nothing to show that they were places of sepulture. It must, however, be confessed that they have not yet been fully excavated. Further experiments should be made in them, and tunnels opened into their very foundations. The only Assyrian sepulchre hitherto discovered is probably the vaulted chamber in the high mound of Nimrud, which may have once contained the remains of the royal builder of the Northwest Palace. Did the Assyrians, like the fire-worshippers of Persia, expose their dead until naught remained but the bleached bones, or did they burn them and then scatter their ashes to the winds? Not a clue is given to their customs in this matter by any bas-relief or monument hitherto discovered. The Assyrians appear to have avoided all allusions to their dead and to their funeral rites, unlike the Egyptians, who portrayed the ceremonies observed after death, and even the events of a future state, upon the walls of almost every temple and tomb. The only relics found at Koyunjik which I can refer to the Achaemenian Persian period are the remains of several dishes and vases in serpentine and marble. One fragment of this nature is inscribed with Egyptian hieroglyphics characteristic, according to Mr. Birch, of the time of the Ptolemies. Of Assyrian relics obtained from the ruins, the most interesting are a colossal beardless head in limestone, remarkable for the boldness of the style. It is probably part of a lion sphinx, handles in the form of the heads of lions, and other fragments of vases and dishes. A fragment of striped marble, carved with figures in relief, and bearing an inscription with the genealogy and titles of Esar-Haddon. A gold earring, adorned with pearls, resembling those still in common use amongst Arab women. a rude circular vessel in limestone, ornamented on the outside with figures in relief of the Assyrian Hercules struggling with the lion, molds for casting earrings and other ornaments in gold and silver. The forms upon them are all purely Assyrian, as the lion-headed deity, the cone, the bull's head, and the sacred sign seen in the Nimrod, sculptures round the neck of the king. The largest mold is in limestone, the others in serpentine. They are precisely such as are used to this day by Arab goldsmiths. Various copper instruments, one in the shape of a sickle, a key, a comb, and other objects such as the heads of spears and arrows in iron, glass bottles, pottery, fragments of terracotta, and marble with inscriptions, and many other relics, all of which, with those above enumerated, are now in the British Museum. I had long been desirous of making some experiments in the mound on which stands the so-called tomb of the prophet Jonah. It forms part of the great group of ruins opposite Mosul, and is, like Koyunjik, in the line of the enclosure walls. Some have believed it to represent the real site of ancient Nineveh, Koyunjik being the remains of a palace, added to the city at a later period. It was important, therefore, to ascertain the nature and probable date of the edifice covered by the mound. The sanctity of the place prevented any attempt to excavate openly, and it was necessary to carry on my researches without exciting the suspicion of the Mussulman inhabitants of the neighborhood. A village has risen round the moss containing the tomb. The rest of the mound is occupied by a burying ground thickly set with Mussulman gravestones. True believers from the surrounding country bring their dead to this sacred spot, and to disturb a grave on Nebi Yunus would cause a tumult which might lead to no agreeable results. The pretended tomb itself is in a dark inner room. None but Mussulmans should be admitted within the holy precincts. But I have more than once visited the shrine, with the sanction of my good friend, Mullah Sultan, a guardian of the mosque. A square plaster or wooden sarcophagus, entirely concealed by a green cloth, embroidered with sentences from the Koran, stands in the center of an apartment spread with a common European carpet. A few ostrich eggs and colored tassels, such as are seen in similar Mohammedan buildings, hang from the ceiling. A small grated window looks into the hall where the true believers assemble for prayer. A staircase leads into the holy chamber. It is needless to repeat that the tradition which places the tomb on this spot is a mere fable. The village of Nebi Yunus is inhabited by Turkoman families. Some of their dwellings occupy a considerable space. Hearing that the owner of one of the largest wished to make serdabs or underground apartments for summer, I offered through my agent, Tomashishman, to dig them for him, on condition that I should have all the relics and sculptures discovered during the excavations. By these means, I was able to examine a small part of the mound. After a few days' labor, the workmen came to the walls of a chamber. They were paneled with inscribed but unsculptured alabaster slabs. The inscriptions merely contained the name, titles, and genealogy of Esarhaddon, such as were found on the bulls and sphinxes of the southwest palace at Nimrod. Several bricks and fragments of stone were also obtained from the ruins, but they all bore the same inscription. No remains whatever of more ancient building, and no relics of an earlier period were discovered during my residence at Mosul, in the mound of the prophet Jonah. Since my return to England, an inhabitant of the village, whilst digging the foundation of his house, uncovered a pair of colossal human-headed bulls, and 2 figures of the Assyrian Hercules slaying the lion, similar to those in the Louvre. He communicated his discovery at once to the English vice-consul, who informed Mr. Hodder, the artist sent out by the trustees of the British Museum. Through some neglect, these interesting specimens were not visited and secured before others became acquainted with their existence and endeavored to obtain possession of them. The Turkish authorities, of course, settled the claims of the rival antiquaries by seizing the sculptures for themselves. On several grounds this is much to be regretted. These remains will, however, probably prove to be of the time of Esarhaddon. 3 miles to the north of the enclosure of Koyunjik, and on the bank of the Tigris, is a village called Sharif Khan. Near it are several mounds. The largest, though much inferior in size to the great ruins of Assyria, is distinguished, like those of Nimrud and Khorsabad, by a conical heap at one corner. For some time excavations were carried on in this mound under my superintendence, and discoveries of interest were made in it. At a small depth, beneath the surface of the soil, are the remains of a building. The walls of the chambers are of sun-dried bricks, but several slabs of alabaster and painted and inscribed bricks were found in the ruins. A broad flight of alabaster steps appeared to connect an upper with the lower part of the edifice. The inscriptions upon the bricks contained the names of Sargon and Sennacherib. Those of the former king read, Sargon, king of Assyria. The city or place of the mound of the fort of Sargon I called it a temple of the sun. Near it I built. Other bricks mention a temple dedicated to Mars or some other Assyrian deity. There are several smaller mounds in the neighborhood which have not been explored. At Nimrud, the excavations had been almost suspended. A few Arabs, still working in the center of the mound, had found the remains of sculptured walls forming part of the edifice previously discovered there. The lower half of several colossal figures, amongst them winged men struggling with lions and mythic animals, had been preserved. A few small objects of interest were discovered in different parts of the ruins, and some additional rooms were explored in the northwest and southeast palaces. In none of them, however, were there sculptures or even inscriptions, except such as were impressed on bricks. The bricks found amongst its ruins prove that it was built by the grandson of Esarhaddon, who must consequently have been one of the last of the Assyrian kings. Several tombs containing vases, beads, and ornaments were discovered above the center palace. A few large earthen jars from different parts of the mound, a number of small cups of peculiar shape from the ruins of the upper chambers, other pottery of various kinds, and some rude figures in baked clay were the principal relics found during the excavations at Nimrud. In the northwest palace was also discovered a duck with its head turned upon its back, in green stone similar to that in white marble engraved in the first series of the monuments of Nineveh. These two objects are of considerable interest, as we learn from short inscriptions upon them, deciphered by Dr. Hinds, that they are weights of 30 manna, or half a Babylonian talent. They have been examined at the mint, and are found to weigh 40 pounds, 4 ounce, 4 deadweight ton, 4 grams, and 39 pounds, 1 ounce, 1 deadweight ton, and 6 grams. The difference between them is owing to the head of one having been broken off. It may be inferred that two similar figures in baked clay, inscribed with Assyrian numerals from the same ruins, and others of small size in agate, onyx, and other hard materials, are likewise weights, probably parts of the talent or of the manna. It is also highly probable that the curious series of bronze lions, discovered at Nimrud during my first researches, were used for a like purpose. Since the coating of green rust has been removed from them, they are found in several instances to bear two short inscriptions, one in cuneiform characters with the name of Sennacherib, the other in Phoenician or cursive Semitic letters, accompanied by parallel lines or notches cut in the bronze. Dr. Lepsius has recently published a bas-relief from an Egyptian tomb representing a man weighing rings of gold or silver, with weights in the form of a bull's head, and of a seated lion with a ring on its back, precisely similar to those from Nineveh now in the British Museum. The engraved cylinders or gems, of which a large collection was brought by me to England, form an important as well as an interesting class of Assyrian and Babylonian antiquities. They vary in size from about 2 inches to a quarter of an inch, and are either circular or barrel shaped, or slightly curved inwards. They are usually of lapis lazuli, rock crystal, cornelian, amethyst, chalcedony, agate, onyx, jasper, quartz, serpentine, cyanide, oriental alabaster, green feldspar, and hematite. The workmanship varies in different specimens. That of some being of considerable sharpness and delicacy, and that of others so coarse as scarcely to enable us to recognize the objects engraved upon them. The subjects are generally either religious or historical, usually the former, and on many are short inscriptions in the cuneiform character. These cylinders belong to several distinct periods. The most ancient with which I am acquainted are those of the time of the kings, who built the oldest edifices hitherto discovered at Nineveh. The subjects are usually the king in his chariot, discharging his arrows against a lion or wild bull, warriors in battle, the monarch or priest in adoration before the emblem of the deity, the eagle-headed god, winged bulls and lions, and other mythical animals accompanied by the common Assyrian symbols, the sun, the moon, the 7 stars, the winged globe, the sakar tree, and the wedge or conitic element. The next in order of date are those of the time of Sargon and his successors. To this period belong the cylinder with the fish god, and that which I believe to be the signet of Sennacherib himself, described in a previous part of this work. A very fine specimen, cut in agate, represents an Assyrian goddess, perhaps Astarte, or the moon, surrounded by 10 stars, with a dog seated before her. In front of her is the moon's crescent, and a priest in an attitude of adoration. A tree and a rampant goat, both common Assyrian symbols, complete the group. On others of the same age, we find the gods represented under various forms, the king and priests worshipping before them, altars in various signs peculiar to the period, and the usual mythic emblems. The pure Babylonian cylinders are mostly commonly found in European collections than the Assyrian. They are usually engraved with sacred figures, accompanied by a short inscription in the Babylonian cuneiform character, containing the names of the owner of the seal and of the divinity, under whose particular protection he had probably placed himself. They are usually cut in a red iron ore or hematite, which appears to have been a favorite material for such objects. Many specimens, however, are in agate, jasper, and other hard substances. A class of cylinders of very rude workmanship, and usually in hematite, are probably of the latest Babylonian period. Upon them are usually found the figures of various deities, especially of Venus, sometimes represented with the waters of life flowing from her breast. A few cylinders and gems, Syrian in character, are inscribed with Semitic letters, resembling the Phoenician and cursive Babylonian. They are rare, and have chiefly been found, I believe, in ruins on the banks of the Euphrates to the north of Babylon, near Hit and Anna. I would attribute them, therefore, to the Semitic population which inhabited the districts on the eastern borders of the Syrian desert. They appear to belong to various periods, from the time of the Lower Assyrian dynasty, of which 3 fine specimens are in possession of Captain Jones of Baghdad, to that of the Persian occupation of Babylonia. Persian cylinders frequently bear an inscription in the cuneiform character peculiar to the monuments of the Achaemenian dynasty. The most interesting specimen of this class is the well-known gem of green chalcedony in the British Museum, on which is engraved King Darius in his chariot with his name and that of his father. This was probably a royal signet. Another in the same collection bears the name of one Arsaces, who appears to have been a chamberlain or to have held some other office in the Persian court. A very fine cylinder in rock crystal, brought by me to this country, and now also in the British Museum. has the god Ormuz represented as at Persepolis, raised by two winged bulls with human heads above an oval containing the image of a king. The engraving on this gem is remarkable for its delicacy and minuteness. Persian cylinders are recognized at once by the draperies of the figures gathered up into folds, as in the sculptures of the Achaemenid dynasty, a peculiarity never found on pure Assyrian or Babylonian monuments, by the crown of the king, by the form of the supreme deity, or Ormuz, and by the monstrous animals resembling the sculptures on the walls of Persepolis. It has been conjectured that these cylinders were amulets, engraved with a kind of horoscope of the owner, or with the figures of the deities who were supposed to preside over his nativity and fortunes, but it is evident from the specimens above described that they were seals or signets to be impressed on clay and other materials on which public and private documents were written. Herodotus states that the Babylonians were accustomed to have their signets constantly with them, as a modern Eastern always carries his seal. The seal was evidently rolled on the moist clay at the same time as the letters were impressed. The tablet was then placed in the furnace and baked. All these cylinders have been pierced, and one specimen, found by my workmen in a mound in the desert near the Sinjar, still retained its copper setting. They revolve upon a metal axis like a garden rolling stone. Such then were the objects of sculpture and the small relics found at Nimrod and Koyunjik. I will now endeavor to convey to the reader in conclusion a general idea of the results of the excavations, as far as they may tend to increase our acquaintance with the history of Syria, and to illustrate the religion, the arts, and the manners of her inhabitants. End of Chapter 25, Part 2, recording by Wilma Magastino. Chapter 26, Part 1 of Discoveries Among the Ruins of Nineveh and Babylon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wilma Magastino. Discoveries Among the Ruins of Nineveh and Babylon by Austen Layard. Chapter 26, Part 1. Although 10 years have barely elapsed since the first discovery of ruins on the site of the great city of Nineveh, a mass of information, scarcely to be overrated for its importance and interest, has already been added to our previous knowledge of the early history and comparative geography of the East. When in 1849 I published the narrative of my first researches in Assyria, the numerous inscriptions recovered from the remains of the buried palaces were still almost a sealed book. For although an interpretation of some had been hazarded, it was rather upon mere conjecture than upon any well-established philological basis. I then, however, expressed my belief that ere long their contents would be known with almost certainty, and that they would be found to furnish a history previously almost unknown of one of the earliest and most powerful empires of the ancient world. Since that time the labors of English scholars, and especially of Colonel Rawlinson and Dr. Hinks, and of M. de Saulcy and other eminent investigators on the continent, have nearly led to the fulfillment of those anticipations, and my present work would be incomplete were I not to give a general sketch of the results of their investigations, as well as of my own researches. I will not detain the reader by any account of the various processes adopted in deciphering, and of the steps gradually made in the investigation. Nor will I recapitulate the curious corroborative evidence which has led in many instances to the verification of the interpretations. Such details, philologically of the highest interest and very creditable to the sagacity and learning of those pursuing this difficult inquiry, will be found in the several treatises published by the investigators themselves. The results, however, are still very incomplete. It is indeed a matter of astonishment that, considering the time which has elapsed since the discovery of the monuments, so much progress has been already made. But there is every prospect of our being able ere long to ascertain the general contents of almost every Assyrian record. The Babylonian column of the Besutan inscription, that invaluable key to the various branches of cuneiform writing, has at length been published by Colonel Rawlinson, and will enable others to carry on the investigation upon sure grounds. I will proceed, therefore, to give a slight sketch of the contents of the inscriptions as far as they have been examined. The earliest king of whose reign we have any detailed account was the builder of the Northwest Palace at Nimrud, the most ancient edifice hitherto discovered in Assyria. His records, however, with other inscriptions, furnish the names of 5, if not 7, of his predecessors, some of whom, there is reason to believe, erected palaces at Nineveh, and originally founded those which were only rebuilt by subsequent monarchs. It is consequently important to ascertain the period of the accession of this early Assyrian king, and we apparently have the means of fixing it with sufficient accuracy. His son, we know, built the center palace at Nimrud, and raised the obelisk now in the British Museum, inscribing upon it the principal events of his reign. He was a great conqueror, and subdued many distant nations. The names of the subject kings who paid him tribute are duly recorded on the obelisk, in some instances with sculptured representations of the various objects sent. Amongst those kings was one whose name reads Jehu, the son of Cumri or Omri, and who has been identified by Dr. Hinks and Colonel Rawlinson with Jehu, king of Israel. This monarch was certainly not the son, although one of the successors of Omri, but the term son of appears to have been used throughout the East in those days, as it still is, to denote connection generally, either by descent or by succession. Thus we find in Scripture the same person called the son of Nimshi, and the son of Jehoshaphat, the son of Nimshi, an identification connected with this word Cumri or Omri, as one of the most interesting instances of corroborative evidence that can be adduced of the accuracy of the interpretations of the cuneiform character. It was observed that the name of a city resembling Samaria was connected, and that in inscriptions containing very different texts, with one reading Bet Cumri or Romri. This fact was unexplained until Colonel Rawlinson perceived that the names were, in fact, applied to the same place, or one to the district, and the other to the town. Samaria having been built by Umri, nothing is more probable than that, in accordance with the common Eastern custom, it should have been called, after its founder, Beth Cumri, or the house of Omri. As a further proof of the identity of the Jehu mentioned on the obelisk with the king of Israel, Dr. Hinks, to whom we owe this important discovery, has found on the same monument the name of Hazael, whom Elijah was ordered by the Almighty to anoint king of Syria. Supposing, therefore, these names to be correctly identified, and our Assyrian chronology for this period rests as yet, it must be admitted, almost entirely upon this supposition, we can fix an approximate date for the reign of the obelisk king. Jehu ascended the throne about 885 BC. The accession of the Assyrian monarch must, consequently, be placed somewhere between the time and the commencement of the 9th century BC, and that of his father in the latter part of the 10th. In his records, the builder of the Northwest Palace mentions, amongst his predecessors, a king whose name is identical with the one from whom, according to the inscriptions at Babian, were taken certain idols of Assyria. 418 years before the first or second year of the reign of Sennacherib. According to Dr. Hinks, Sennacherib ascended the throne in 703 BC. We have therefore 1121 BC for the date of the reign of this early king. There are still 2 kings mentioned by name in the inscriptions from the Northwest Palace at Nimrud, as ancestors of its builder, who have not yet been satisfactorily placed. It is probable that the earliest reigned somewhere about the middle of the 12th century BC. Colonel Rawlinson calls him the founder of Nineveh, but there is no proof whatever
as far as I am aware, in support of this conjecture. It is possible, however, that he may have been the first of a dynasty which extended the bounds of the Assyrian Empire, and was founded, according to Herodotus, about 5 centuries before the Median invasion, or in the 12th century BC. But there appears to be evidence to show that a city bearing the name of Nineveh stood on the banks of the Tigris long before that period. The second king, whose name is unplaced, appears to be mentioned in descriptions as the original founder of the Northwest Palace at Nimrod. According to the views just expressed, he must have reigned about the end of the 12th century BC. The father and grandfather of the builder of the Northwest Palace are mentioned in nearly every inscription from that edifice. Their names, according to Colonel Rawlinson, are Adramelech and Anachomerodach. They must have reigned in the middle of the 10th century BC. We have no records of either of them. The first king, of whom we have any connected historical chronicle, was the builder of the well-known edifice at Nimrod, from which were obtained the most perfect and interesting bas-reliefs brought to this country. In my former work, I stated that Colonel Rawlinson believed his name to be Ninus, and had identified him with that ancient king, according to Greek history, the founder of the Assyrian Empire. He has since given up this reading, and has suggested that of a Sardanapal, agreeing with the historic Sardanapalus. Dr. Hinks, however, assigning a different value to the middle character, the name being usually written with 3, reads Ashurak-Pal. It is certain that the first monogram stands both for the name of the country of Assyria and for that of its protecting deity. We might consequently assume, even were other proof wanting, that it should be read Assur or Ashur. I have elsewhere given a description of the various great monumental records of this king, with extracts from their contents. He appears to have carried his arms to the west of Nineveh, across Syria to the Mediterranean Sea, to the south into Chaldea, probably beyond Babylon. The name of this city does not, however, as far as I am aware, occur in the inscriptions, and to the north into Asia Minor and Armenia. Of his son, whose name Colonel Rawlinson reads Temenbar and Devanovara, and Dr. Hinks Devanobar, we have full and important historical annals, including the principal events of 31 years of his reign. They are engraved upon the black obelisk and upon the backs of the bulls in the center of the mound of Nimrod. This king, like his father, was a great conqueror who waged war, either in person or by his generals, in Syria, Armenia, Babylonia, Chaldea, Media, and Persia. The 2 royal names next in order occur on the pavement slabs of the upper chambers, on the west face of the mound of Nimrod. They may belong to the son and grandson and immediate successors of the obelisk king. The 2 names, however, have not been satisfactorily deciphered. Colonel Rawlinson reads them Shamasadar and Adramelech II. Dr. Hinks only ventures to suggest Shamsiab for the first. On the Assyrian tablet from the tunnel of Negab are apparently 2 royal names, which may be placed next in order. They are merely mentioned as those of ancestors or predecessors of the king, who caused the record to be engraved. Dr. Hinks reads them Baldasi and Ashurkish. As the inscription is much mutilated, some doubt may exist as to the correctness of its interpretation. The next king of whom we have any actual records appears to have rebuilt or added to the palace in the center of the mound of Nimrod. The edifice was destroyed by a subsequent monarch, who carried away its sculptures to decorate a palace of his own. All the remains found amongst its ruins, with the exemption of the great bulls and the obelisk, belong to a king whose name occurs on a pavement slab discovered in the southwest palace. The walls and chambers of this building were, it will be remembered, decorated with bas-reliefs brought from elsewhere. By comparing the inscriptions upon them, and upon a pavement slab of the same period, with the sculptures in the ruins of the center palace, we find that they all belong to the same king, and we are able to identify him through a most important discovery, for which we are also indebted to Dr. Hinks. In an inscription on a bas-relief representing part of a line of war chariots, he has detected that the name of Menahem, the king of Israel, amongst those of other monarchs, paying tribute to the king of Assyria, in the 8th year of his reign. This Assyrian king must consequently have been either the immediate predecessor of Pul himself, or Tiglath-Pileser, the name on the pavement slab not having yet been deciphered. The bas-reliefs adorning his palace, like those at Khorsabad, appear to have been accompanied by a complete series of his annals. Unfortunately, only fragments of them remain. His first campaign seems to have been in Chaldea, and during his reign he carried his arms into the remotest parts of Armenia, and across the Euphrates into Syria, as far as Tyre and Sidon. There is a passage in one of his inscriptions, still unpublished, which reads, "As far as the river Ocharesh," that might lead us to believe that his conquests were even extended to the central provinces of Asia and to the Oxus. His annals contain very ample lists of conquered towns and tribes. Amongst the former are Haran and Ur. He rebuilt many cities, and placed his subjects to dwell in them. The next monarch, whose name is found on Assyrian monuments, was the builder of the palace of Khorsabad, now so well known from Embata's excavations, and the engravings of its sculptures, published by the French government. His name, though read with slight variations by different interpreters, is admitted by all to be that of Sargon, the Assyrian king mentioned by Isaiah. The names of his father and grandfather are said to have been found on a clay tablet discovered at Kayanchik, but they do not appear to have been monarchs of Assyria. The ruins of Khorsabad furnish us with the most detailed and ample annals of his reign. Unfortunately, an inscription containing an account of a campaign against Samaria in his 1st or 2nd year has been almost entirely destroyed, but in one still preserved, 27,280 Israelites are described as having been carried into captivity by him from Samaria and the several districts or provincial towns dependent upon that city. Sargon, like his predecessors, was a great warrior. He even extended his conquests beyond Syria to the islands of the Mediterranean Sea, and a tablet set up by him has been found in Cyprus. He warred also in Babylonia, Susiana, Armenia, and Media, and apparently received tribute from the kings of Egypt. Colonel Rawlinson believed that the names Tiglath-Pileser and Shalmaneser were found on the monuments of Khorsabad as epithets of Sargon, and that they were applied in the Old Testament to the same king. He has now changed his opinion with regard to the first, and Dr. Hinks contends that the second is not a name of this king, but of his predecessor, of whom, however, it must be observed, we have hitherto been unable to trace any mention on the monuments, unless, as that scholar suggests, he is alluded to in an inscription of Sargon from Khorsabad. From the reign of Sargon we have a complete list of kings to the fall of the empire, or to a period not far distant from that event. He was succeeded by Sennacherib, whose annals have been given in a former part of this volume. His name was identified, as I have before stated, by Dr. Hinks, and this great discovery furnished the first satisfactory starting point from which the various events recorded in the inscriptions have been linked with the scripture history. Colonel Rawlinson places the accession of Sennacherib to the throne in 716, Dr. Hinks in 703, which appears to be more in accordance with the canon of Ptolemy. The events of his reign, as recorded in the inscriptions on the walls of his palace, are mostly related or alluded to in sacred and profane history. I have already described in Wars in Judea, and have compared his own account with that contained in Holy Writ. His second campaign in Babylonia is mentioned in a fragment of Polyhistor preserved by Eusebius, in which the name given to Sennacherib's son, and the general history of the war, appear to be nearly the same as those on the monuments. The fragment is highly interesting as corroborating the accuracy of the interpretation of the inscriptions. I was not aware of its existence when the translation given in the 6th chapter of this volume was printed. After the reign of the brother of Sennacherib, Assises reigned over the Babylonians, and when he had governed for the space of 30 days, he was slain by Merodach-Baladan, who held the empire by force during 6 months. And he was slain and succeeded by a person named Elibus Belib. But in the 3rd year of his Elibus reigned Sennacherib king of the Assyrians, levied an army against the Babylonians, and in a battle in which they were engaged, routed and took him prisoner with his adherents, and commanded them to be carried into the land of the Assyrians. Having taken upon himself the government of the Babylonians, he appointed his son Asardanius their king, and he himself retired again into Assyria. This son, however, was not Esarhaddon, his successor on the throne of Assyria. The two names are distinguished by a distinct orthography in the cuneiform inscriptions. Sennacherib raised monuments and caused tablets recording his victories to be carved in many countries which he visited and subdued. His image and inscriptions at the mouth of the Narel Kelb in Syria are well known. During my journey to Europe, I found one of his tablets near the village of Hassana, or Hassan Aga, chiefly remarkable from being at the foot of Gebel Judi, the mountain upon which, according to a widespread Eastern tradition, the Ark of Noah rested after the deluge. Esarhaddon, his son, was his successor. As we know from the Bible, he built the southwest palace at Nimrod, and an edifice whose ruins are now covered by the mound of the tomb of Jonah opposite Mosul. Like his father, he was a great warrior, and he styles himself in his inscriptions, King of Egypt, Conqueror of Ethiopia. It was probably this king who carried Manasseh, king of Jerusalem, captive to Babylon. The name of the son and successor of Esarhaddon was the same as that of the builder of the northwest palace at Nimrod. His father had erected a dwelling for him in the suburbs or on the outskirts of Nineveh. His principal campaign appears to have been in Susiana or Elam, as the great number of the inscribed tablets found in the ruins of the palace of Sennacherib at Koyunjik are of his time, many of them bearing his name. We may hope to obtain some record of the principal events of his reign. His son built the southeast palace on the mound of Nimrod, probably over the remains of an earlier edifice. Bricks from its ruins give his name, which has not yet been deciphered, in those of his father and grandfather. We know nothing of his history from contemporaneous records. He was one of the last, if not the last, king of the 2nd dynasty, and may indeed, as I have already suggested, have been that monarch, Sardanapalus, or Syracuse, who was conquered by the combined armies of the Medes and Babylonians under Cyaxares in BC 606, and who made of his palace, his wealth, and his wives one great funeral pile. For convenience of reference, I give a table of the royal names, according to the version of Dr. Hinks and Colonel Rawlinson, the principal monuments on which they are found, and the approximate date of the reigns of the several kings. In a second table will be found the most important proper and geographical names in the Assyrian inscriptions which have been identified with those in the Bible. A third table contains the names of the 13 great gods of Assyria, according to the version of Dr. Hinks. Table 1. Names of Assyrian kings in the inscriptions from Nineveh. First, conjectural reading. Second, where found. Third, approximate. Date of reign. Number 1. Dersito by Rawlinson. Divanaresh by Hicks. Papenslav, BM Series, page 70, 125. Approximate date of reign, 1250 BC. Number 2. Divanuka by Rawlinson. Standard inscription, Nimrod, and c. 1200 BC. Number 3. Anakbar Bithira by Rawlinson. Shemish Baal Bekere by Hinks. Slabs from temples in north of Mound of Nimrod. Bavian tablets. 1130 BC. Marduk-Kempad by Rawlinson. and Messissimo-Dacos by Rawlinson, a cylinder from Sharif Khan. Number 4. Adramelech I by Rawlinson. Standard inscription, breaks in C, from Northwest Palace, Nimrod, 1000 BC. Number 5. Anak Merodach by Rawlinson. Shemish Bar by Hinks, son of preceding. Idem, 960 BC. Number 6. Sardanapalus I by Rawlinson. Ashurbanipal by Hinks, son of preceding. Standard inscription, breaks in C, from Northwest Palace, Nimrod, Abu Maria and C. 930 BC. Number 7. Devanubara by Rawlinson. Devanubar by Hinks, son of preceding. Center Palace, Nimrod, obelisk, breaks Kalashargat, Bashika, 900 BC. Number 8. Shamas Adar by Rawlinson. Shamsiya by Hinks, pavement slab, upper chambers, Nimrod, 870 BC. Number 9. Adramelech II by Rawlinson. Idem, 840 BC. Number 10. Baltasi, Hinks, slab from the tunnel of Negev. Number 11. Ashur-Kish, Hinks, Idem. Number 12. Pul or Tiglath-Pileser, pavement slab, and slabs built into the southwest palace, Nimrod, 750 BC. Number 13. Sargon, Khorsabad Nimrod Karamles in C, 722 BC. Number 14. Sennacherib, son of preceding, Kayonjik in C, 703 BC. Number 15. Esarhaddon, son of preceding, Southwest Palace, Nimrod, Nebi Yunus Sharif Khan, 690 BC. Number 16. Sardanapalus III by Rawlinson. Ashurbanipal by Hinks, son of preceding, Kayonjik Sharif Khan. Number 17. Son of preceding, Ezi Edifice Nimrod. Number 18. Shamishakdon by Hinks, black stone in possession of Lord Aberdeen. Table 2. Names of kings, countries, cities, and sea mentioned in the Old Testament, which occur in the inscriptions: Jehu, Omri, Menahem, Hezekiah, Hazael, Merodach-Baladan, Pharaoh, Sargon, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, Dagon, Nabo, Judea, Jerusalem, Samaria, Ashdod, Lachish, Damascus, Hamath, Hittites, Tyre, Sidon, Gaza, Ekron, Ashkelon, Arad, Gubal, the people of Lebanon, Egypt, Euphrates, Carchemish, Hebar or Kebar River, Haran, Gozan, the people of Mesopotamia, children of Eden, Tigris, Nineveh, Babylon, Elam, Shushan, Media, Persia, Yavan, Ararat, Havarenes, Nabateans, Arameans, Chaldeans, Meshech, Tubal, Assyria, Assyrians, Petar, Telassar. Table 3. Names of 13 great gods of Assyria, as they occur on the upright tablet of the king, discovered at Nimrod. Number 1. Ashur, the king of the circle of the great gods. Number 2. Anu, the lord of the mountains, or of foreign countries. Number 3. Not yet deciphered. Number 4. Sun. Number 5. Merodach, Mars. Number 6. Yai, Jupiter. Number 7. Bar. Number 8. Nebo, Mercury. Number 9. Milit, or Gula, called the consort of Bel and the mother of the great gods, or Venus. Number 10. Dagon. Number 11. Bel, Saturn, father of the gods. Number 12. Shamash, the sun. Number 13. Ishtar, the moon. Although no mention appears to be made in the Assyrian inscriptions of kings who reigned before the 12th century BC, this is by no means a proof that the empire and its capital Nineveh did not exist long before that time. I cannot agree with those who would limit the foundation of both to that period. The supposition seems to me quite at variance with the testimony of sacred and profane history. The existence of the name of Nineveh on monuments of the 18th Egyptian dynasty is still considered almost certain, by Egyptian scholars. I have in my former work quoted an instance of it on a tablet of the time of Thutmose III, or of the beginning of the 14th century B.C. Mr. Birch has since pointed out to me 3 interesting catalogues, copied by Dr. Lepsius in Egypt, which completely remove any doubt as to the name of Assyria, having been also known as early as the 18th dynasty. They occur at the foot of one of the columns of Celeb, and are of the age of Amenophis III, or about the middle of the 14th century before Christ. The 3 figures, with their arms bound behind, represent Asiatic captives, as is proved by their peculiar features and head-dress, a knotted fillet round the temples, corresponding with that seen in the Nineveh sculptures. Each character contains the name of the country from which the prisoner was brought. The first is Patana, or Padanaram, the second is written Assuru, or Assyria, and the third Karukamishi, or Karchemish. On another column are Sinkar, Shinar, or Sinjar, Naharaina, or Mesopotamia, and Dakita, or Hittite. The mention in succession of these Asiatic nations, contiguous one to the other, proves the correctness of the reading of the word Assyria, which might have been doubted had the name of that country stood alone. Mr. Birch has detected a still earlier notice of Assyria in the statistical tablet of Ranach. The king of that country is there stated to have sent to Thutmose III in his 40th year a tribute of 50 pounds 9 ounces of some article called chessbit, supposed to be a stone for coloring blue. It would appear, therefore, that in the 15th century a kingdom, known by the name of Assyria, with Nineveh for its capital, had been established on the borders of the Tigris. Supposing the date now assigned by Colonel Rawlinson to the monuments at Nimrod to be correct, no sculptures or relics have yet been found, which we can safely attribute to that period. Future researches and a more complete examination of the ancient signs may, however, hereafter lead to the discovery of earlier remains. As I have thus given a general sketch of the contents of the inscriptions, it may not be out of place to make a few observations upon the nature of the Assyrian records, and their importance to the study of scripture and profane history. In the first place, the care with which the events of each king's reign were chronicled is worthy of remark. They were usually written in the form of regular annals, and in some cases, as on the great monoliths at Nimrod, the royal progress during a campaign appears to have been described almost day by day. We are thus furnished with an interesting illustration of the historical books of the Jews. There is, however, this marked difference between them, that whilst the Assyrian records are nothing but a dry narrative, or rather register, of military campaigns, spoliations, and cruelties, events of little importance but to those immediately concerned in them, the historical books of the Old Testament, apart from the deeds of war and blood which they chronicle, contain the most interesting of private episodes, and the most sublime of moral lessons. It need scarcely be added that this distinction is precisely what we might have expected to find between them, and that the Christian will not fail to give to it a due weight. The monuments of Nineveh, as well as the testimony of history, tend to prove that the Assyrian monarch was a thorough Eastern despot, unchecked by popular opinion, and having complete power over the lives and property of his subjects, rather adored as a god than feared as a man, and yet himself claiming that authority and general obedience and virtue of his reverence for the national deities and the national religion. It was only when the gods themselves seemed to interpose that any check was placed upon the royal pride and lust, and it is probable that when Jonah entered Nineveh crying to the people to repent, the king, believing him to be a special minister from the supreme deity of the nation, arose from his throne, and laid his robe from him, and covered him with sackcloth, and sat in ashes. The Hebrew state, on the contrary, was to a certain extent a limited monarchy. The Jewish kings were amenable to, and even guided by the opinion of their subjects. The prophets boldly upbraided and threatened them. Their warnings and menaces were usually received with respect and fear. Good is the word of the Lord, which thou hast spoken, exclaimed Hezekiah to Isaiah, when the prophet reproved him for his pride, and foretold the captivity of his sons, and the destruction of his kingdom, a prophecy which none would have dared utter in the presence of the Assyrian king, except, as it would appear by the story of Jonah, he were a stranger. It can scarcely, therefore, be expected that any history other than bare chronicles of the victories and triumphs of the kings, omitting all allusion to the reverses and defeats, could be found in Assyria, even were portable rolls or books still to exist, as in Egypt, beneath the ruins. It is remarkable that the Assyrian records should, on the whole, be so free from the exaggerated forms of expression and the magniloquent royal titles which are found in Egyptian documents of the same nature, and even in those of modern Eastern sovereigns. I have already pointed out the internal evidence of their truthfulness so far as they go. We are further led to place confidence in the statements contained in the inscriptions by the very minuteness with which they even give the amount of the spoil. The two registrars, the scribes of the host, as they are called in the Bible, being seen in almost every bas-relief, writing down the various objects brought to them by the victorious warriors, the heads of the slain, the prisoners, the cattle, the sheep, the furniture, and the vessels of metal. The next reflection, arising from an examination of the Assyrian records, relates to the political condition and constitution of the empire, which appear to have been of a very peculiar nature. The king, we may infer, exercised but little direct authority beyond the immediate districts around Nineveh. The Assyrian dominions, as far as we can yet learn from the inscriptions, did not extend much further than the central provinces of Asia Minor and Armenia to the north, not reaching to the Black Sea, though probably to the Caspian. To the east they included the western provinces of Persia, to the south Susiana, Babylonia, and the northern part of Arabia. To the west the Assyrians may have penetrated into Lycia, and perhaps Lydia, and Syria was considered within the territories of the great king. Egypt and Meroe, or Ethiopia, were the farthest limits reached by the Assyrian armies. According to Greek history, however, a much greater extent must be assigned to Assyrian influence, if not to the actual Assyrian Empire, and we may hereafter find that such was in fact the case. I am here merely referring to the evidence afforded by actual records as far as they have been deciphered. The empire appears to have been at all times a kind of confederation, formed by many tributary states, whose kings were so far independent that they were only bound to furnish troops to the supreme lord in time of war, and to pay him yearly a certain tribute. Hence we find successive Assyrian kings fighting with exactly the same nations and tribes, some of which were scarcely more than 4 or 5 days' march from the gates of Nineveh. The Jewish tribes, as it had long been suspected by biblical scholars, can now be proved to have held their dependent position upon the Assyrian king, from a very early period indeed, long before the time inferred by any passage in Scripture. Whenever an expedition against the kings of Judah or Israel is mentioned in the Assyrian records, it is stated to have been undertaken on the ground that they had not paid their customary tribute. The political state of the Jewish kingdom under Solomon appears to have been very nearly the same as that of the Assyrian Empire. The inscriptions in this instance again furnish us with an interesting illustration of the Bible. The scriptural account of the power of the Hebrew king resembles, almost word for word, some of the paragraphs in the great inscriptions at Nimrod. Solomon reigned over the kingdoms, from the river unto the land of the Philistines, and unto the border of Egypt. They brought presents, and served Solomon all the days of his life. He had dominion over all the region on this side the river, from Tisza even unto the Yaza, over all the kings on this side the river. In the custom, frequently alluded to in the inscriptions, of removing the inhabitants of conquered cities and districts to distant parts of the empire, and of replacing them by colonies from Nineveh or from other subdued countries, we have another interesting illustration of scripture history. It has generally been inferred that there was but one carrying away, or at the most two, of the people of Samaria, although three at least appear to be distinctively alluded to in the Bible. The first by Poole, the second by Tilgat-Philoser, and the third by Shalmaneser. It was not until the time of the last king that Samaria was destroyed as an independent kingdom. On former occasions, only the inhabitants of the surrounding towns and villages seem to have been taken as captives. Such we find to have been the case with many other nations who were subdued or punished for rebellion by the Assyrians. The conquerors, too, as we also learn from the inscriptions, established the worship of their own gods in the conquered cities, raising altars and temples, and appointing priests for their service. So after all the fall of Samaria, the strangers who were placed in its cities made gods of their own, and put them in the houses of the high places which the Samaritans had made. The vast number of families that sent to dwell in distant countries must have wrought great changes in the physical condition, language, and religion of the people with which they were intermixed. When the Assyrian records are with more certainty interpreted, we may perhaps be able to explain many of the anomalies of ancient Eastern philology and comparative geography. End of Chapter 26, Part 1. Recording by Wilma Magastino. Chapter 26, Part 2 of Discoveries Among the Ruins of Nineveh and Babylon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wilma Magastino. Discoveries Among the Ruins of Nineveh and Babylon by Austen Layard. Chapter 26, Part 2. We further gather from the records of the campaigns of the Assyrian kings that the country, both in Mesopotamia and to the west of the Euphrates, now included in the general term of the desert, was at that remote period teeming with a dense population, both sedentary and nomad, that cities, towns, and villages arose on all sides, and that, consequently, the soil brought forth produce for the support of this great congregation of human beings. All those settlements depended almost exclusively upon artificial irrigation, hence the dry beds of enormous canals and countless watercourses, which are spread like a network over the face of the country. Even the traveler, accustomed to the triumphs of modern science and civilization, gazes with wonder and awe upon these gigantic works, and reflects with admiration upon the industry, the skill, and the power of those who made them. And may not the waters be again turned into the empty channels, and may not life be again spread over those parched and arid ways? Upon them no other curse has alighted than that of a false religion and a listless race. Of the information as to the religious system of the Assyrians, which may be derived from the inscriptions, I am still unwilling to treat in the present state of our knowledge of their contents. A far more intimate acquaintance with the character than we yet possess is required before the translation of such documents can be fully relied on. All we can now venture to infer is that the Assyrians worship one supreme god as the great national deity under whose immediate and special protection they live, and their empire existed. The name of this god appears to have been Ashur, as nearly as can be determined at present from the inscriptions. It was identified with that of the empire itself, always called the country of Ashur. It entered into those of both kings and private persons, and was also applied to particular cities, with Ashur, but apparently far inferior to him in the celestial hierarchy. Although called the great gods, were associated 12 other deities, whose names I have given in table number 3. Some of them may possibly be identified with the divinities of the Greek pantheon, although it is scarcely wise to hazard conjectures which must ere long been again abandoned. These 12 gods may also have presided over the 12 months of the year, and the vast number of still inferior gods. In one inscription, I believe, stated to be no less than 4,000 over the days of the year, various phenomena and productions of nature and the celestial bodies. It is difficult to understand such a system of polytheism, unless we suppose that whilst there was but one supreme god, represented sometimes under a triune form, all the so-called inferior gods were originally mere names for events and outward things, or symbols and myths, although at one time generally accepted as such even by the common people. Their true meaning was only known in a corrupted age to the priests, by whom they were turned into a mystery and a trade. It may indeed be inferred from many passages in the Scriptures that a system of theology not far differing from the Assyrian prevailed at times amongst the Jews themselves. Ashur is generally, if not always, typified by the winged figure in the circle. The question as to the space occupied by the city of Nineveh at the time of its greatest prosperity is still far from being set at rest. Colonel Rawlinson, founding his opinion upon the names on bricks from the several sites, believes the enclosures of Nimrod, Koyunjik, and Khorsabad, and the small mounds of Sharif Khan, scarcely 3 miles from Koyunjik, as well as others in the immediate neighborhood, to be the remains of distinct cities. He would even separate the mound of Nebi Yunus from Koyunjik, identifying the former with Nineveh, and making the latter a mere suburb. A glance at the plan of the ruins will show this conjecture to be quite untenable. Discoveries in both mounds prove that they belong to nearly the same period, and that Nebi Yunus is the more recent of the two. The supposition that any of these groups of mounds represent alone the city of Nineveh can in no way be reconciled with the accounts in Scripture and the Greek authors, which so remarkably coincide as to its extent, a difficulty which leads Colonel Rawlinson to say that all these ruins form one of that group of cities which, in the time of the prophet Jonah, were known by the common name of Nineveh. It is indeed true that on bricks from different mounds distinct names appear to be given to each locality, and that those from Koyunjik are inscribed with the name of Nineveh, whilst those from Nimrod and Khorsabad bear others which have not yet been satisfactorily deciphered. These names are preceded by a determinative monogram assumed to signify a city, but which, undoubtedly, also applies to a fort or fortified palace. Nahum describes Nineveh as a city of many strongholds and gates, and such I believe it to have been, each fort or stronghold having a different name. The most important, as it was the best defended, may at one time have been the palace at Koyunjik, which being especially called Nineveh, gave its name to the whole city. By no other supposition can we reconcile the united testimony of ancient writers as to the great size of Nineveh with the present remains. It is very doubtful whether these fortified enclosures contained many buildings beside the royal palaces, and such temples and public edifices as were attached to them. At Nimrod, excavations were made in various parts of the enclosed space, and it was carefully examined with a view to ascertain whether any foundations or remains of houses still existed. None were discovered except at the southeastern corner, where the height of the earth above the usual level at once showed the existence of ruins. In most parts of the enclosure, the natural soil seems never to have been disturbed, and in some places the conglomerate rock is almost denuded of earth. Such is also the case opposite Mosul. The remains of 1 or 2 buildings appear to exist within the enclosure, but in the greater part there are no indications whatever of ancient edifices, and the conglomerate rock is, as at Nimrod, on a level with the surrounding soil. At Khorsabad, the greater part of the enclosed space is so much below the surrounding country that it is covered with a marsh formed by the small river Kasr, which flows near the ruins, Within the walls, which are scarcely more than a mile square, can only be traced the remains of one or two buildings, and of a propylum, standing below the platform, and about 200 yards from the ascent to the palace, but they are at once perceived by well-defined inequalities in the soil. If the walls forming the enclosures of Khorsabad and other Assyrian ruins were the outer defences of a city, abruptly facing the open country, it is difficult to account for the fact of the palace having been built in the same line, and actually forming part of them. All access to it must have been strongly fortified, and even the view over the surrounding country, the chief object of such a position, must have been shut out. After several careful excavations of the ruins, and of the spaces enclosed by the ramparts of earth, I am still inclined to the opinion that they were royal dwellings with their dependent buildings, and parks or paradises, fortified like the palace temples of Egypt, capable of standing a prolonged siege, and a place of refuge for the inhabitants in case of invasion. They may have been called by different names, but they were all included within the area of that great city, known to the Jews and to the Greeks as Nineveh. I will not pretend to say that the whole of this vast space was strictly inhabited or built upon. As I have elsewhere observed, we must not judge of Eastern cities by those of Europe. In Asia, gardens and orchards, containing suburbs and even distinct villages, collected round the walled city, are all included by the natives under one general name. Such is the case with Isfahan and Damascus, and such I believe it to have been with ancient Nineveh. A few remarks are necessary on the additional information afforded by recent discoveries as to the architecture and architectural decorations, external and internal, of the Assyrian palaces. The inscriptions on their walls, especially in those of Kayonjik and Khorsabad, appear to contain important and even minute details not only as to their general plan and mode of construction, but even as to the materials employed for their different parts, and for the objects of sculpture and ornaments placed in them. This fact furnishes another remarkable analogy between the records of the Jewish and the Assyrian kings to the history of their monarchs and of their nation. The Hebrew chroniclers have added a full account of the building and adornments of the temple and palaces of Solomon. In both cases, from the use of technical words, we can scarcely hope to understand, with any degree of certainty, all the details. It is impossible to comprehend, by the help of the descriptions alone, the plan or appearance of the Temple of Solomon. This arises not only from our being unacquainted with the exact meaning of various Hebrew architectural terms, but also from the difficulty experienced even in ordinary cases of restoring from mere description an edifice of any kind. In the Assyrian inscriptions we labor, of course, under still greater disadvantages. The language in which they are written is as yet but very imperfectly known, and although we may be able to explain with some confidence the general meaning of the historical paragraphs, yet, when we come to technical words relating to architecture, even with a very intimate acquaintance with the Assyrian tongue, we could scarcely hope to ascertain their precise signification. On the other hand, the materials and the general plan of the Assyrian palaces are still preserved, whilst of the great edifices of the Jews, not a fragment of masonry, nor the smallest remains are left to guide us. The architecture of the one people, however, may be illustrated by that of the other, with the help of the sacred books, and of the ruins of the palaces of Nineveh, together with that of contemporary and later remains, as well as from customs still existing in the East. We may, to a certain extent, restore the principal buildings of both nations. Before suggesting a general restoration of the royal edifices of Nineveh, I shall endeavor to point out the analogies which appear to exist between their actual remains and what is recorded of the temple and palaces of Solomon. In the first place, as Sennacherib in his inscriptions declares himself to have done, The Jewish king sent the bearers of burdens and the hewers into the mountains to bring great stones, costly stones, and huge stones to lay the foundations, which were probably artificial platforms, resembling the Assyrian mounds, though constructed of more solid materials. We have the remains of such a terrace or stage of stone masonry, perhaps built by King Solomon himself at Baalbek. The enormous size of some of the hewn stones existing in that structure, and of those still seen in the quarries, some being more than 60 feet long, has excited the wonder of modern travelers. The dimensions of the Temple of Jerusalem, 60 cubits long, 20 broad and 30 high, were much smaller than those of the great edifices explored in Assyria. Solomon's own palace, however, appears to have been considerably larger, and to have more nearly approached in its proportions those of the kings of Nineveh, for it was 100 cubits long, 50 broad, and 30 high. The porch before the temple, 20 cubits by 10, may have been a propylem, such as was discovered at Khorsabad, in front of the palace. The chambers, with the exception of the oracle, were exceedingly small, the largest being only 7 cubits broad, for without, in the wall of the house, he made numerous rests round about, that the beams should not be fastened in the walls of the house. The words in italics are inserted in our version to make good the sense, and may consequently not convey the exact meaning, which may be that these chambers were thus narrow that the beams might be supported without the use of pillars. A reason already suggested for the narrowness of the greater number of chambers in the Assyrian palaces. These smaller rooms appear to have been built round a large central chamber, called the oracle, the whole arrangement thus corresponding with the halls and surrounding rooms at Nimrod, Khorsabad, and Koyunjik. The oracle itself was 20 cubits square, smaller far in dimensions than the Nineveh halls, but it was 20 cubits high. An important fact, illustrative of Assyrian architecture, for as the building was 30 cubits in height, the oracle must not only have been much loftier than the adjoining chambers, but must have had an upper structure of 10 cubits. Within it were the 2 cherubim of olive wood 10 cubits high, with wings each 5 cubits long, and he carved all the house around with carved figures of cherubim and palm trees, and open flowers within and without. The cherubim have been described by biblical commentators as mythic figures, uniting the human head with the body of a lion or an ox and the wings of an eagle. If for the palm trees we substitute the sacred tree of the Nineveh sculptures, and for the open flowers the Assyrian tulip-shaped ornament, objects most probably very nearly resembling each other, we find that the oracle of the temple was almost identical, in general form and in its ornaments, with some of the chambers of Nimrod and Khorsabad. In the Assyrian halls, too, the winged human-headed bulls were on the side of the wall, and their wings, like those of the cherubim, touched one another in the midst of the house. The dimensions of these figures were in some cases nearly the same, namely 15 feet square. The doors were also carved with cherubim, and palm trees, and open flowers, and thus, with the other parts of the building, corresponded with those of the Assyrian palaces. On the walls at Nineveh, the only addition appears to have been the introduction of the human form in the image of the king, which were an abomination to the Jews. The pomegranates and lilies of Solomon's temple must have been nearly identical with the usual Assyrian ornament, in which, and particularly at Khorsabad, the pomegranate frequently takes the place of the tulip and the cone. But the description given by Josephus of the interior of one of Solomon's houses, already quoted by Mr. Ferguson in support of his ingenious arguments, even more completely corresponds with and illustrates the chambers in the palaces of Nineveh. Solomon built some of these houses with stones and wainscoted the walls with other stones that were sought and were of great value, such as were dug out of the bowels of the earth, for ornaments of temples and sea. The arrangement of the curious workmanship of these stones was in 3 rows, but the 4th was preeminent for the beauty of its sculpture, for on it were represented trees in all sorts of plants, with the shadows caused by their branches and the leaves that hung down from them. These trees and plants covered the stone that was beneath them, and their leaves were wrought so wonderfully thin and subtile that they appeared almost in motion, but the rest of the wall up to the roof was plastered over, as it were, wrought over with various colors and pictures. To complete the analogy between the 2 edifices, it would appear that Solomon was 7 years building a temple, and Sennacherib about the same time building his great palace at Koyunjik. The ceiling, roof, and beams of the temple were of cedar wood. The discoveries in the ruins at Nimrod show that the same precious wood was used in the Assyrian edifices, and the king of Nineveh, as we learn from the inscriptions, employed men, precisely as Solomon had done, to cut it in Mount Lebanon. Fire was also employed in the Jewish buildings, and probably in those of Assyria. In the proposed restoration of the palace at Koyunjik from the existing remains, the building does not face the cardinal points of the compass. I will, however, assume, for convenience sake, that it stands due north and south. To the west, therefore, it immediately overlooked the Tigris, and on that side was one of its principal facades. The edifice must have risen on the very edge of the platform, the foot of which was at that time washed by the river. If, therefore, there were any access to the palace on the river front, it must necessarily have been by a flight of steps, or an inclined way leading down to the water's edge, and there might have been great stairs parallel to the basement walls at Persepolis, although from the fact of there having been a grand entrance to the palace on this side, it is highly probable that some such approach once existed. No remains whatever of it have been discovered. The western facade, like the eastern, was formed by 5 pairs of human-headed bulls, and numerous colossal figures, forming 3 distinct gateways. The principal approach to the palace appears, however, to have been on the eastern side, where the great bulls bearing the annals of Sennacherib still stand. In the frontispiece I have been able, by the assistance of Mr. Ferguson, to give a restoration of this magnificent facade. An entrance, inclined ways, or broad flights of steps, appear to have led up to it from the foot of the platform, and the remains of them, consisting of huge squared stones, are still seen in the ravines, which are but the ancient ascents deepened by the winter rains of centuries. From this grand entrance direct access could be had to all the principal halls and chambers in the palace, that on the western face, as appears from the ruins, only opened into a set of 8 rooms. The chambers hitherto explored appear to have been grouped round 3 great halls. It must be borne in mind, however, that the palace extended considerably to the northeast of the grand entrance, and that there may have been another hall, and similar dependent chambers, in that part of the edifice. Only a part of the palace has been hitherto excavated, and we are not in possession of a perfect ground plan of it. The general arrangement of the chambers at Koyunjik is similar to that of Khorsabad, though the extent of the building is very much greater. It is also to be remarked that the Khorsabad mount falls gradually to the level of the plain, apparently showing the remains of a succession of broad terraces, and that parts of the palace, such as the propylae, were actually beneath the platform, and removed some distance from it in the midst of the walled enclosure. At Koyunjik, however, the whole of the royal edifice, with its dependent buildings, appears to have stood on the summit of the artificial basement, whose lofty perpendicular sides could only have been accessible by steps or inclined ways. No propylae or other edifices connected with the palace have as yet been discovered below the platform. The inscriptions appear to refer to 4 distinct parts of the palace, 3 of which, inhabited by the women, seem subsequently to have been reduced to 1. It is not clear whether they were all on the ground floor or whether they formed different stories. Mr. Ferguson, in his ingenious work on the restoration of the palaces of Nineveh, in which he has, with great learning and research, fully examined the subject of the architecture of the Assyrians and ancient Persians, availing himself of the facts then furnished by the discoveries, endeavors to divide the Karsabad palace, after the manner of modern Mussulman houses, into the salamlik, or apartments of the men, and the harem, or those of the women. The division he suggests must of course depend upon conjecture, but it may, I think, be considered as highly probable until fuller and more accurate translations of the inscriptions than can yet be made may furnish us with some positive data on the subject. In the ruins of Kayonjik there is nothing, as far as I am aware, to mark the distinction between the male and female apartments. Of a temple no remains have as yet been found at Kayonjik, nor is there any high conical mound as at Nimrod and Karsabad. In all the Assyrian edifices hitherto explored, we have the same general interior plan. On the 4 sides of the great halls are 2 or 3 narrow parallel chambers opening one into the other. Most of them have doorways at each end leading into smaller rooms, which have no water outlet. It seems highly probable that this uniform plan was adopted with reference to the peculiar architectural arrangements required by the building, and I agree with Mr. Ferguson in attributing it to the mode resorted to for lighting the apartments. In my former work, I expressed a belief that the chambers receive light through an opening in the roof. Although this may have been the case in some instances, yet recent discoveries now prove that the Assyrian palaces had more than 1 story. Such being the fact, it is evident that other means must have been adopted to admit daylight to the inner rooms on the ground floor. Mr. Ferguson's suggestion that the upper part of the halls and principal chambers was formed by a row of pillars supporting the ceiling and admitting a free circulation of light and air appears to me to meet, to a certain extent, the difficulty. It has moreover been borne out by subsequent discoveries and by the representation of a large building, apparently a palace, on one of the bas-reliefs discovered at Kayonjik. In the restoration of the exterior of the Kayonjik palace, forming a frontispiece to this volume, a somewhat similar capital has been adopted in preference to that taken by Mr. Ferguson from Persepolis, which, although undoubtedly like the other architectural details of those celebrated ruins, Assyrian in character, are not authorized by any known Assyrian remains. A row of pillars, or of alternate pillars and masonry, would answer the purpose intended if they opened into a well-lighted hall. Yet inner chambers, such as are found in the ruins of Kayonjik, must have remained in almost entire darkness, and it is not improbable that such was the case, to judge from modern Eastern houses, in which the absence of light is considered essential to secure a cool temperature. The sculptures and decorations in them could then only be seen by torchlight. The great halls were probably, in some cases, entirely open to the air, like the courtyards of the modern houses of Mosul, whose walls are still adorned with sculptured alabaster. When they were covered in the roof was borne by enormous pillars of wood or brickwork, and rose so far above the surrounding part of the building that light was admitted by columns and buttresses immediately beneath the ceiling. It is most probable that there were 2 or 3 stories of chambers opening into them, either by columns or by windows. Such appears to have been the case in Solomon's temple, where Josephus tells us that the great inner sanctuary was surrounded by small rooms. Over these rooms were other rooms, and others above them, equal both in their measure and numbers, and that these reached to a height to equal to the lower part of the house. for the upper had no buildings about it. We have also an illustration of this arrangement of chambers in the modern houses of some parts of Persia, in which a great central hall called an Iwan rises to the top of the building and has small rooms in 2 or 3 separate stories, opening by windows into it, whilst the inner chambers, having no windows at all, have no more light than that which reaches them through the door. Sometimes these side chambers open into a center court, as I have suggested may have been the case in the Nineveh palaces. Then a projecting roof of woodwork protects the carved and painted walls from injury by the weather. Curtains and awnings were also suspended above the windows and entrances to ward off the rays of the sun. End of chapter 26, part 2. Recording by Wilma Magastino.
Chapter 26, Part 3 of Discoveries Among the Ruins of Nineveh and Babylon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Discoveries Among the Ruins of Nineveh and Babylon by Austen Layard. Chapter 26, Part 3. Although no remains or even traces of pillars have hitherto been discovered in the Assyrian ruins, I now think it highly probable, as suggested by Mr. Ferguson, that they were used to support the roof. It is curious, however, that no stone pedestals, upon which wooden columns may have rested, have been found in the ruins, nor are there marks of them on the pavement. I can scarcely account for the entire absence of all such traces. However, unless some support of this kind were resorted to, it is impossible that even the large chambers at Koyunjik, without including the central halls, could have been covered in. The great hall, or house as it is rendered in the Bible, of the forest of Lebanon was 30 cubits high, upon 4 rows of cedar pillars with cedar beams upon the pillars. The Assyrian kings, we have seen, cut wood in the same forest as King Solomon, and probably used it for the same purposes, namely for pillars, beams, and ceilings. The dimensions of this hall, 100 cubits, about 150 feet, by 50 cubits, 75 feet, very much resembled those of the center halls of the palaces of Nineveh. The porch of pillars was 50 cubits in length, equal therefore to the breadth of the hall, of which I presume it to have been an enclosed space at the upper end, whilst the porch for the throne where he might judge, even the porch of judgment, covered with cedar wood from one side of the floor to the other, was probably a raised place beneath it corresponding with a similar platform where the host and guests of honor are seated in a modern Eastern house. Supposing the 3 parts of the building to have been arranged as I have suggested, we should have an exact counterpart of them in the hall of the audience of the Persian palaces. The upper part of the room, which I have frequently seen the governor of Isfahan, was divided from the rest of the magnificent hall by columns, and his throne was a raised place of carved woodwork adorned with rich stuffs, ivory, and other precious materials. Suppliants and attendants stood outside the line of pillars, and the officers of the court within. Such also may have been the interior arrangement of the great halls in the Assyrian edifices. That the Ninevite palaces had more than one story, at least in some parts if not in all, can now no longer be doubted. The inscriptions appear to describe distinctly the upper rooms, and at Koyunjik, as it has been seen, an inclined way was discovered leading to them. Without there had been an upper structure, it would be impossible to account for the enormous accumulation of rubbish, consisting chiefly of remains of buildings, over the ruins of Koyunjik and Khorsabad. These upper rooms were probably built of sun-dried bricks and wood, but principally of the latter material, and may have been connected with the lower by winding staircases, as in the Temple of Solomon, as well as by inclined ways. The roofs were flat, as those of all Eastern houses are to this day, and, as suggested by Mr. Ferguson, they may have been crowned by a wooden tilar, or platform, and altars upon which sacrifices were offered, the houses upon whose roofs they have burned incense unto all the host of heaven, and have poured out drink offerings to other gods. I have already described the internal decorations of the Assyrian palaces, and have little more to add upon the subject. The walls of Koyunjik were more elaborately decorated than those of Nimrud and Khorsabad. Almost every chamber explored, and they amount to above 70, was paneled with alabaster slabs carved with numerous figures and with the minutest details. Each room appears to have been dedicated to some particular event, and in each, apparently, was the image of the king himself. In fact, the walls recorded in sculpture what the inscriptions did in writing, the whole history of Sennacherib's reign, his great deeds in peace as well as in war. It will be remarked that whilst in other Assyrian edifices the king is frequently represented taking an active part in the war, slaying his enemies, and fighting beneath a besieged city, he is never represented at Koyunjik otherwise than in an attitude of triumph, in his chariot or on his throne, receiving the captives and the spoil. Nor is he ever seen torturing his prisoners or putting them to death with his own hand. There were chambers, however, in the palace of Sennacherib, as well as in those of Nimrud and Khorsabad, whose walls were simply coated with plaster, like the walls of Belshazzar's palace at Babylon. They may have been richly ornamented in color with figures of men and animals, as well as with elegant designs, or they may have been paneled with cedar wainscoting, as the chambers in the temple and palaces of Solomon and in the great edifices of Babylon. Gilding, too, appears to have been extensively used in decoration, and some of the great sphinxes may have been overlaid with gold, like the cherubim in Solomon's temple. At Koyunjik, the pavement slabs were not inscribed as at Nimrud, but those between the winged bowls at some of the entrances were carved with an elaborate and very elegant pattern. The doors were probably of wood, gilt and adorned with precious materials, like the gates of the Temple of Jerusalem, and they appear to have turned in stone sockets, for amongst the ruins were found many black stones hollowed in the center, and bearing an inscription in these words: Sennacherib, the great king, king of Assyria, brought this stone from the distant mountains, and used it for the sockets of the pillars of the doors of his palace. To ward off the glare of an eastern sun, hangings or curtains of gay colors and of rich materials were probably suspended to the pillars supporting the ceiling, or to wooden poles raised for the purpose, as in the palaces of Babylon and Shushan. Such hangings, as we have seen, appear to be described in the tablets of King Nebuchadnezzar. The frontispiece to this volume will enable the reader to understand how they were used. This engraving from a beautiful watercolor drawing, made by Mr. Baines under the superintendence of Mr. Ferguson, represents the eastern facade and the great entrance to the palace of Sennacherib, as they are supposed originally to have been. The lower part of the building actually exists, and is drawn to scale. The upper part, of course, is mainly funded upon conjecture, but the preceding remarks may show that we are not altogether without materials to authorize some such restoration. The edifice represented in the bas-relief discovered at Koyunjik has furnished some of the architectural details. The battlemented finish to the walls is still seen at Koyunjik and Nimrud, and the various decorations introduced in other places are all taken from Assyrian monuments. The two poles with streamers in the foreground are from a bas-relief at Khorsabad. The sculptures at the sides of the steps are those from the descending passage at Koyunjik. The stone facing of the platform is that of the basement of the tower at Nimrud. The lions, Assyrian in character, are placed on the steps conjecturally, and the steps themselves are restored. The design upon the pavement is found on slabs at the entrances at Koyunjik. The excavations carried on at Nimrud during the last expedition have enabled me to restore, to a certain extent, the several buildings on the platform, and to obtain some idea of their original appearance. On the artificial platform, built of regular layers of sun-dried bricks in some parts, and entirely of rubbish in others, but cased on all sides with solid stone masonry, stood at one time at least 9 distinct buildings. Between each was a terrace paved with stone, or with large kiln-burnt bricks from 1½ to 2 feet square. At the northwestern corner rose the great tower, the tomb of the founder of the principal palace. Its basement was encased with massive masonry of stone, relieved by recesses and other architectural ornaments. The upper part, built of brick, was most probably painted, like the palaces of Babylon, with figures and mythic emblems. Its summit I conjecture to have consisted of several receding gradines, like the top of the black obelisk, and I would venture to crown it with an altar on which may have burnt the eternal fire. Adjoining this tower were 2 small temples dedicated to Assyrian gods. One actually abutted on it, although there was no communication whatever, as far as I could discover, between the interior of the 2 buildings. The other was about 100 feet to the east. They were both adorned with sculptures, and had evidently been more than 1 story high, and their beams and ceilings were of cedar wood. They contained statues of the gods, and the fullest records of the reign of the king their founder, engraved on immense monoliths. Between them was a way up to the platform from the north. Between the small temples in the northwest palace were 2 great flights of steps, or inclined ways, leading up from the margin of the river. Their sites are still marked by deep ravines. They opened upon a broad paved terrace. The northwest palace having been so fully described in my former work, I need only add that I have now been able to ascertain the position of its principal facade and entrance. It was to the north, facing the tower, and nearly resembled the grand approaches to Koyunjik in Khorsabad. The 2 gateways formed by the sphinxes with the human form to the waist appear to have flanked a grand center portal, to which they were united on both sides, as in Sennacherib's palace, by colossal figures of human-headed bulls and lions and winged priests. The remains of no other great entrance to the palace have yet been discovered, but I have little doubt from several indications in the ruins that there was a similar facade on the riverside, and that a terrace, ascended by broad flights of steps, overlooked the Tigris. To the south of the northwest palace was a 3rd ascent to the summit of the platform, also marked by a ravine in the side of the mound. Beyond it were the upper chambers, built by the 4th king in succession from Sardanapalus, probably over the remains of an earlier edifice. Excavations made in different parts of the small mound covering the ruins show that they consisted of 3 distinct groups built round a solid central mass of sun-dried bricks. The great accumulation of earth above them proves that this building must have had more than 1 story. The upper chambers were separated from the palace of Esarhaddon, the most southern on this side of the platform, by a 4th grand approach to the terraces. Remains of great blocks of stone, of winged bulls, and of colossal figures in yellow limestone were found in the ravine. Esarhaddon's palace was raised some feet above the northwest and center edifices. It has been so entirely destroyed by fire, and by the removal of the slabs from its walls, that a complete ground plan of it cannot be restored. In the arrangement of its chambers, as far as we are able to judge from the ruins, it differed from other Assyrian buildings with which we are acquainted. The hall, above 220 feet long and 100 broad, opening at the northern end by a gateway of winged bulls on a terrace, which overlooked the grand approach and the principal palaces, and at the opposite end having a triple portal guarded by 3 pairs of colossal sphinxes, which commanded the open country and the Tigris winding through the plain, must have been a truly magnificent feature in this palace. It occupied the corner of the platform, and an approach of which considerable remains still exist led up from the plain to its southern face. Around the grand hall appear to have been built a number of small chambers, and this Assyrian building probably answers in its general plan, more than any other yet discovered, to the descriptions in the Bible of the Palace of Solomon, especially if we assume that the antechamber, divided into 2 parts, corresponds with the portico of the Jewish structures. The palace of Esarhaddon was considerably below the level of that of his grandson, and was separated from it what by appears from a very deep and wide ravine to have been the principal approach to the platform. The southeast edifice was very inferior, both in size of its apartments and in the materials employed in its construction, to the other royal buildings. It was probably built when the empire was fast falling to decay, and, as is usual in such cases, the arts seem to have declined with the power of the people. Returning northwards, we come to the only traces of an approach on the eastern side of the platform, and consequently from the interior of the walled enclosure. It is remarkable that there should have been but 1 on this face, and it is even more curious that the only sides of the mound on which there are any remains of walls or fortifications are the eastern and northern, where the royal residences would have overlooked the city, supposing it to have been contained within the existing ramparts of earth. The edifices facing what would in that case have been the open country were left apparently defenseless. On the west side of the platform, no actual ruins have been discovered, although there are undoubtedly traces of buildings in several places, and I think it not improbable that a temple, or some similar edifice, stood there. It only remains for me to mention the palace in the center of the platform, founded by the king whose name is believed to read Divanubar or Divanubra, but rebuilt almost entirely by Pul or Tiglath-Pileser. Excavations carried on during the second expedition brought to light the walls of a few additional chambers and numerous fragments of interesting sculptures. But the edifice was so utterly destroyed by Esarhaddon, who used the materials in the construction of his own dwelling place, that it is impossible to ascertain its general plan or even the arrangement of any of its rooms. The great inscribed bulls and the obelisk we know to have been of the time of the older king, and the bas-reliefs of battles and sieges, heaped together as if ready for removal, to have belonged to the later. In the ramparts of earth, marking the enclosure wall of Nimrud to the north, 58 towers can still be distinctly traced. To the east there were about 50, but all traces of some of them are entirely gone. To the south the wall has almost disappeared, so that it could not have been of great size or thickness on that side. The level of the enclosure is here, however, considerably above the plain, and it is not improbable that the Tigris actually flowed beneath part of it, and that the remainder was defended by a wide and deep ditch, either supplied by the small stream still running near the ruins or by the river. At the southeastern corner of the enclosure is a mound of considerable height and the remains of a square edifice. They may have been a fort or a castle. I searched in vain for traces of gates in the walls on the northern side. A high double mound, which probably marks the ruins of an entrance, was excavated, but no stone masonry or sculpted figures were discovered, as in a similar mound in the enclosure of Koyunjik. I conclude, therefore, that the gateways of the quarter of Nineveh, represented by Nimrud, were not, like those of the more northern divisions of the city, adorned with sculptures, but were built of the same materials as the walls, and were either arched or square, being formed, like the gates of modern Arab cities, by simple beams of wood. It is evident that the enclosure of Nimrud was regularly fortified, and defended by walls built for the purpose of resisting an enemy, and sustaining a prolonged siege. That of Khorsabad was precisely similar. There also the platform, on which the great palace stood, formed part of the walls, a fact for which I can scarcely offer any satisfactory explanation. It would seem more consistent with security that the dwelling of the king, the temples of the gods, and the edifices containing the archives and treasures of the kingdom should have been in the center of the fortifications, equally protected on all sides. The palaces of Nimrud and Koyunjik, built on a platform washed by a deep and broad river, were to a certain extent guarded from the approach of an enemy. But at Khorsabad such was not the case. The royal residence overlooked the plain country, and was accessible from it, unless the summit of the platform were strongly fortified on the western side, of which there is no trace. Of the fortified enclosures still existing, that surrounding Koyunjik is most remarkable, and was best calculated to withstand the attack of a powerful and numerous army. I give a plan of the ruins from Mr. Rich's survey, which will enable the reader to understand the following description. Plan of the enclosure walls and ditches at Koyunjik. Its form, it will be perceived, was irregular. The side facing the river, including the mounds of Koyunjik and Nebi Yunus, A, and the northern or northwestern, B, are at right angles to each other, and in nearly a straight line. From the eastern corner of the northern face, the inner wall, C, forms the segment of a circle towards the southern end of the western, the two being only 873 yards apart at their extremities, D. On the four sides are the remains of towers and curtains, and the walls appear to have consisted of a basement of stone and an upper structure of sun-dried bricks. The top of the stone masonry was ornamented with gradines, as at Nimrud. The western wall, A, was washed by the river and needed no other defense. A deep ditch, of which traces still exist, appears to have been dug beneath the northern, B. That to the south, D, was also protected by a dike and the Tigris. The side most accessible to an enemy was that to the east, C, and it was accordingly fortified with extraordinary care and strength. The small river Cowser flows nearly in a direct line from the hills to the northeastern corner of the enclosure, makes a sweep to the south at E before reaching it, and after running for some distance beneath a perpendicular bank formed by conglomerate hills, G, parallel to the walls, but about 3/4 of a mile from them, again turns to the westward at F, and enters the enclosure almost in the center. It then traverses this quarter of the city, winds around the base of Koyunjik, and falls into the Tigris. Nearly 1/2 of the eastern wall was, consequently, provided with natural defenses. The Cowser served as a ditch, and the conglomerate ridge, slightly increased by artificial means, as a strong line of fortification. The remains of one or more ramparts of earth are still to be traced between the stream and the inner wall, but they could not have been of very considerable size. The northeastern extremity of these outer defenses appears to have joined the ditch which it was carried along the northern face of the enclosure, thus completing the fortification in this part. Below, or to the south of, the entry of the Cowser into the enclosure, the inner wall was defended by a complete system of outworks. In the first place, a deep ditch, about 150 feet wide, was cut immediately beneath it, and was divided for half its length into 2 separate parts, between which was a rampart. A parallel wall, H, was then carried from the banks of the Cowser to the dike on the southern side of the enclosure. A second ditch, about 108 feet wide, and of considerable depth, probably supplied by the Cowser, extended from the point at which that stream turns to the westward as far as the southern line of defenses. A third wall, I, the remains of which are above 100 feet high on the inner face, abutted to the north on the ridge of conglomerate hills, G, and completed the outer defenses. A few mounds rising in the level country beyond, the principal of which, near the southern extremity of the lines, is called Tala Zembel, the mound of the basket, appear to have been fortified outposts, probably detached towers, such as are represented in the bas-reliefs of Koyunjik. An enemy coming from the east, the side on which the enclosure was most open to attack, had consequently first to force a stupendous wall strengthened by detached forts. 2 deep ditches and 2 more walls, the inner being scarcely inferior in size to the outer, had then to be passed before the city could be taken. The remains still existing of these fortifications almost confirm the statements of Diodorus Siculus that the walls were 100 feet high and that 3 chariots could drive upon them abreast, and led to the conclusion that in describing the ramparts forming the circuit round the whole city, ancient historians were confounding them with those which enclosed only a separate quarter or a royal residence, as they have done in speaking of Babylon. Whilst the inner walls were constructed of stone and brick masonry, the outer appear to have consisted of little else than of the earth, loose pebbles, and rubble dug out from the ditches, which were cut with enormous labor into the solid conglomerate rock. The walls and ditches around Koyunjik were a favorite ride during my residence among the ruins. The summit of the outer ramparts commands an extensive and beautiful prospect over all the great mounds, the plains bounded by the several mountain ranges of Kurdistan, the windings of the river, and the town of Mosul. Niue, that which God himself calls the great city, hath not one stone standing which may give memory of the being of a town. 1 English mile from it is a place called Mosul, a small thing, rather to be a witness of the other's mightiness and God's judgment than of any fashion of magnificence in itself. Such are the simple though impressive words of an old English traveller, who probably looked down upon the site of Nineveh from the same spot 2 centuries and a half ago. Beaten tracks from the neighboring villages have for ages led, and still lead, through the ruins. Along them, Arabs and Kurds, with their camels and laden beasts, may be seen slowly wending their way to the town. But the space between the walls is deserted except by the timid gazelle and the jackals and hyenas which make their dens in the holes and caves in the sides of the mounds and in the rocky banks of the ancient ditches. The spring called by the Arabs Tamlamaja, as described by Mr. Rich, is a small pool of cool and refreshing water in a natural cavern, the forepart of which is adorned with an arch, cornice, and stonework, evidently of Roman or Greek construction. Upon the masonry are still to be traced the names of Mrs. Rich and of the companions of the distinguished traveller. End of chapter 26.
Section 34 of Discoveries Among the Ruins of Nineveh and Babylon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Discoveries Among the Ruins of Nineveh and Babylon by Austen Layard. Conclusion. The time was drawing near for my departure. Once more I was about to leave the ruins, amidst which I had spent so many happy hours, and to which I was bound by so many pleasant and solemn ties, and probably to return no more. I only waited the arrival of Abde, the late Pasha of Baghdad, who was now on his way to his new government of Diyarbekir. He was traveling with a large company of attendants, and without a strong escort it was scarcely prudent to venture on a journey. It was doubly necessary for me to have proper protection, as I took with me the valuable collection of bronzes and other small objects discovered in the ruins. I gladly therefore availed myself of this opportunity of joining so numerous and powerful a caravan. At length, after the usual Eastern delays, the Pasha arrived at Mosul. He remained encamped outside the town for 2 or 3 days, and during that time visited the excavations, his curiosity having been excited by the description he had received of the wondrous idols dug out of the ruins. He marveled at what he saw, as a Turk marvels at strange things which he can neither understand nor explain. It would be in vain to speak to him of the true objects of such researches, the knowledge they impart, the lessons they teach, or the thoughts they beget. In these pages I have occasionally indulged in reflections suggested by the scenes I have had to describe, and have ventured to point out the moral of the strange tale I have had to relate. I cannot better conclude than by showing the spirit in which Eastern philosophy and Mussulman resignation contemplate the evidences of ancient greatnesses and civilization, suddenly rising up in the midst of modern ignorance and decay. A letter in my possession contained so true and characteristic a picture of the feelings that such an event excites in the mind of a good Mohammedan, that I here give a literal translation of its contents. It was written to a friend of mine by a Turkish Kadi, in reply to some inquiries as to the commerce, populations, and remains of antiquity of an ancient city in which dwelt the head of the law. These are its words: "My illustrious friend, and joy of my liver, the thing you ask of me is both difficult and useless. Although I have passed all my days in this place, I have neither counted the houses nor have I inquired into the number of the inhabitants. And as to what one person loads on his mules and the other stows away in the bottom of his ship, that is no business of mine. But above all, as to the previous history of this city, God only knows the amount of dirt and confusion that the infidels may have eaten before the coming of the sword of Islam. It were unprofitable for us to inquire into it. O my soul, O my lamb, seek not after the things which concern thee not. Thou camest unto us, and we welcome thee. Go in peace. Of a truth, thou hast spoken many words, and there is no harm done, for the speaker is one, and the listener is another. After the fashion of thy people thou hast wandered from one place to another until thou art happy and content in none. We, praise be to God, were born here and never desire to quit it. Is it possible, then, that the idea of a general intercourse between mankind should make any impression on our understandings? God forbid. Listen, O my son, there is no wisdom equal unto the belief in God. He created the Word, and shall we liken ourselves unto him in seeking to penetrate into the mysteries of his creation? Shall we say, Behold, this star spinneth round that star, and this other star with a tail goeth and cometh in so many years? Let it go. He from whose hand it came will guide and direct it. But thou wilt say unto me, Stand aside, O man, for I am more learned than thou art, and have seen more things. If thou thinkest that thou art in this respect better than I am, thou art welcome. I praise God that I seek not that which I require not. Thou art learned in the things I care not for, and as for that which thou hast seen, I defile it. Will much knowledge create thee a double belly, or wilt thou seek paradise with thine eyes? O my friend, if thou wilt be happy, say, there is no God but God. Do not evil, and thus wilt thou fear neither man nor death, for surely thine hour will come. The meek in spirit, El Fakir, Imam Ali Zadeh. On the 28th of April I bid a last farewell to my faithful Arab friends, and with a heavy heart turned from the ruins of ancient Nineveh. The End. End of section 34. End of Discoveries among the Ruins of Nineveh and Babylon by Austen Layard.